Greetings, everyone. My name is Adriana Sanford, and I am the founding director of the OU Global Risk and Threats Series Leadership Forum. It is morning for some of you, it is afternoon for others, and evening for others. And we are being joined by a global audience and a global group of experts today. This has been put on by the University of Oklahoma, and it is a 4-part series meant to provide real-world solutions in a time of crisis. And we are addressing some of those most critical issues. They are all COVID related. We are live streaming on Manufacturing Talk Radio today, and this will provide basically a way for companies, executives, and the global community to try to understand and really pull together some ideas on how to handle this pandemic, and hopefully also look at some of the other global risks that are out there. This is a collaborative effort between the Michael F. Price College of Business and the OU Center for Intelligence and National Security. We are pulling together ideas because we know that there needs to be reskilling at this point during the transition. And we also are aware of the fact that there are going to be new jobs on the forefront, new employment, new sources for jobs, and businesses need business models. So what has happened is COVID has accelerated some of the risks that are out there, and it has provided new risks for us. We will go ahead and start this series off today with a word from Larry. But before we do that, I will introduce Larry. Before we do that, I want to put in there a disclaimer that everyone who is speaking today, this is not provided as legal advice. And all the content, all the material, and all the everything that you hear today is basically general information. Mind you, this is a very fast-moving pandemic, and it is developing different in different areas and different countries, and the reforms that are coming are changing constantly. So everything that we are providing today may not be up to date. It may be yesterday's news. So keep that in mind. This is here to provide you basically an overview from industry leaders, global leaders, visionaries, and global experts from around the world, but their information is their opinion, not the opinion of other third parties, global organizations, or other individuals. That being said, the first thing I'd like to do is go ahead and thank our sponsors. I think they're a number, and it continues to grow. This is very organic, and it started out small, but as this pandemic has evolved in different ways, we have had more speakers join us, and we have had more sponsors. Spotify, Aon, Willis Towers Watson, Ernst & Young, Coca-Cola Bottling Company, Hellenic Bottling Company in the Netherlands, ISC Squared, one of the largest global organizations in the world for cybersecurity, the Basel Institute for Governance, Atlanta Council on International Relations, the International Enforcement Law Reporter, Manufacturing Talk Radio, which is actually live streaming for us today, Task Force 7, the voice of cybersecurity, Berliner Cochrane and Rowe, Puga Ortiz in Chile, Paradise Partners, World Counting, Search Consultants International, Manchester Financial Intelligence, Strat Americas Intelligenta, and we also, since this is actually, it's no longer STEM that we are looking at, we look at STEAM. We are bringing the arts into this as well. We have Oscar Medina, who is one of our supporters. He is a Latin American singer who actually sang for us during the last event in June. Now, with respect to our speakers for today, I do want to mention that we always have one special guest. The special guest for the June 6th event was Honorable Eduardo Aninat. And Eduardo Aninat, since that time, has been featured as the most global person in Latin America. He is a former Minister of Finance of Chile, the former chairman of the World Bank and the IMF. Today's special guest is Lucian Cernat. Lucian is the head of global trade regulation and international procurement negotiation for the European Commission. And I will speak more to you about Lucian when I present him. But the other special guests that we have 4 continents right now. We have Esti, and Esti Peshin is the general manager for the cyber division of the Israeli aerospace industries. And prior to that, she is the former deputy director of the Elite Technology Unit for the Israeli Defense Forces. My last special guest, Esti, will be speaking on August 22nd. And after that, we have David Schreier, and he will be speaking on September 12th. With each of these speakers, we have a whole bunch of other experts. David is the CEO of ISC Squared. Remember, I mentioned ISC Squared, one of the largest global organizations in the world for cybersecurity. We've got his CEO, and he was formerly the associate CIO for Information Technology Services for the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the former deputy CIO for the U.S. Department of the Interior. We will be speaking more about them in the next events, and you can find more information about us and what we're doing, as well as what every one of these speakers that we have on highlights in our website, which is the OUGRTS website in Price College. Now, with regards to the first person I'd like to introduce is our director of the OU Global Risk and Threats. The OU Global Risk and Threats series lies within the Price College and the Center for Intelligence. And Dr. Larry Regans is the director of the OU Center for Intelligence and National Security. He is also a Regents professor, and one of his former positions was chair of the OECD Group on Energy and the Environment. So he has a lot of other positions, but I will go ahead and let him tell you more about who he is and a few words. Larry?
Thank you. It's a privilege to be part of a truly global dialogue. I want to thank Adriana for organizing this exciting series and all of our guests for taking time out of their weekend to participate in this event. I encourage each of us to listen actively to the presentations and engage our critical thinking going forward so we can work together to overcome the daunting but not insurmountable challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. Simply put, the pandemic offers dramatic evidence that health security and economic security are interconnected domestically and internationally. 5 months ago, while I was in London, I was reading Michael Finkel's novel, The Stranger in the Woods, and I'd like to share a passage that I think captures the essence of this reality for us individually and collectively. The muck that matters most, the bad bacteria, the evil virus, is typically passed through coughs and sneezes and handshakes and kisses. The price of sociability is sometimes our health. He quarantined himself from the human race and thus avoided our biohazards. I really don't think any of us aspire to be in perpetual self-isolation. So as our countries move forward, transitioning from lockdowns, understanding the SARS-CoV-2 virus, COVID-19, and which interventions are safe and effective is critical in a post-lockdown world, because we just don't know when a vaccine will be available for widespread use. Truncating COVID-19 spread and virulence is the only way to resolve the ongoing pandemic. That's why the Center for Intelligence and National Security is excited to be part of this University of Oklahoma effort to contribute to that understanding by sharing the insights of a diverse, talented group of international experts with a truly global audience. It's not too soon to try and place the COVID-19 pandemic in perspective, although it's still evolving, so its final impact will remain unknown, not for months, but actually for years. The November 2019 outbreak, initially localized to Wuhan in China's Hubei province, morphed quickly into a crisis that is global in scope. It took 67 days to reach 100,000 confirmed cases worldwide, but just 4 days to go from 200,000 to 300,000 cases. Emulating exponential growth, As of today, confirmed infections are over 14 million with over 600,000 deaths. Actual prevalence and mortality inevitably are higher than the reported data, and the true toll is likely to remain unknown. The pandemic is actually more than just a public health problem. Unlike the 21st century's two other documented pandemics involving zoonotic transmission of a coronavirus from animals to humans, COVID-19 presents a health crisis with concurrent worldwide economic, political, and social implications. It resembles, for example, the 14th century Black Death from bubonic plague, or the Columbian Exchange, when Europeans exposed indigenous North and South American populations lacking immunity to diseases such as smallpox, measles, and the bubonic plague. I think a key point is occurring simultaneously within a narrow time window globally. The COVID-19 pandemic poses a systemic stress test. That word's often overused, but in this case, I think it's actually an apt metaphor for what we confront individually and collectively. It's generating a perfect storm of adverse health, economic, social, and political impacts, domestically and internationally. Public health, national and international economies, social stability, and confidence in governments have been undermined by the staggering rate of infections and deaths and severe downturn in economic performance linked to the pandemic. The reality of globalization, modern transportation networks, and mass urbanization has literally shrunk the timeline for epidemics to morph into pandemics. Today, we live in a deeply connected, intertwined world. To place the disparity between the disease's spread and the time for governments, corporations, and individuals to react in context, SARS-CoV-2 reached Lombardy in northern Italy within a few months of the initial outbreak in China's Hubei province. In fact, more recent research suggests even sooner than it was anticipated. The 14th century bubonic plague, on the other hand, in the early to mid 13th century, which also originated in China, took years to reach northern Italy in 1347 via Crimea. Similarly, the pandemic revealed the fragility of just-in-time supply chains when the whole world is impacted simultaneously. The magnitude of its economic and social disruption is unparalleled by any event in the 75 years since the end of the Second World War. Literally overnight, unemployment spiraled. Entire sectors, especially transportation and a number of service industries, shut down as the lockdown moved from country to country. Schools and universities, as well as businesses classified as being non-essential, closed, and only now are facing the challenge of reopening. And because SARS-CoV-2 is highly contagious, with many of those infected asymptomatic, emerging from the lockdown phase is not a simple process of reverting to business as usual. Decisions being made today, having moved to reopen, definitely are impacting our options going forward in real time. So getting those decisions right is essential if we want to minimize bad outcomes. I think that's why Adriana should really be commended for organizing and having the vision to bring this forum together. That's where leadership comes into play. In business, in government, in the not-for-profit sector, and actually by each of us individually acting responsibly. One of the key tests of leadership is the ability to recognize a problem before it becomes an emergency. Then take responsibility to act coherently and transparently instead of persisting in denial or obfuscation. It's not like the SARS-CoV-2 virus was a black swan event. So hopefully we can start proactively going forward to build effective leadership and make coherent investments in resiliency, because it's a question of when, not if, we experience another pandemic. After all, this is the third major pandemic that's zoonotic in origin that we've had in this century. I'm confident we'll get to the finish line successfully, drawing on our talent to innovate, adapt, and build the public's trust. My optimism is anchored in the knowledge that each of you is making invaluable contributions so we can emerge safely on the other side of this pandemic. Again, thank you for participating, and it's a privilege to be involved in this.
Thank you, Larry. What Larry is talking about is a global threat that we can actually do something about. A lot of times with global threats, individuals don't know how to handle them. They're not aware of them. Maybe they don't even affect their region. This pandemic, this global pandemic, has affected every country, every sector, every family. So for the first time, we've all been silenced together, and we've all been humbled. And at this point, we have an option, and we actually can, each one of us independently, do something to help. I'd like to go ahead and introduce now the Associate Dean for Faculty and Research Innovation for the Michael F. Price College of Business, Wayne Thomas. Wayne understands the importance of academia joining and collaboratively working with government, with regulators, with the private sector. His background is a background in accounting, but there's a lot more to Wayne. And I really appreciate all his support. And Larry's as well. They've been great.
Well, thank you very much, Adriana. I appreciate that. Most of all, I appreciate your vision. I appreciate your effort. I think it's clear to me, I think it's clear to everybody today that you have a true passion for helping to solve the global risk and threats that we face. So it's just been great to work with you in developing this series. We've got a great start. We've got a great lineup today, and we've got more to come. Larry, I want to thank you for your excellent words to start us off. The Price College of Business at the University of Oklahoma is very excited to be partnering with OU's Center for Intelligence and National Security. Together, we are bringing together some of the most outstanding thought leaders in the world. We have an incredible lineup today. We're going to hear some fabulous topics and people who are truly thoughtful about helping their community. We had an excellent group of speakers for our first event. Many of those are able to join us today to give us quick takeaways at the end. I'm very grateful to them. I'm grateful that so many people are willing to give their time, because we know how precious time is, to come together. We all see that the virus is spiking as we begin to reopen, and we're starting to rethink about how we're doing things, the impact that it's having on individuals, on companies, on entire countries. This is a global issue, and we want global thought leaders to come together so that we can share ideas and attack this virus and its impact on our world as one. And so we are very happy to be part of this global community. So one more time, thank you so much to all of the speakers for lending your time and being with us today. Adriana?
Thank you, Wayne. Yes, some of our speakers actually have been dealing with a lot of personal issues in addition to just COVID when you're sheltered in place. And the efforts and the work that they've done, even to be here or to be recorded today, is much appreciated. I would like to start with our first speaker for this forum today, and he will be talking about the hour of the corporate diplomat. given what's transpired and given the fact that right now we're all struggling, I think one of the most important things to remember and to consider is diplomatic business management. And I can't think of someone better than Horacio Gutierrez, who is Spotify's head of global affairs and chief legal officer. He was previously Microsoft's vice president and general counsel. He is going to be with us and he will go ahead and basically cover this topic. Horacio?
Thank you so much, Adriana. I'm going to share a few slides. Let me try doing this first. Can you see the slides here?
Yes, it looks good.
Looks great.
Great. Wonderful. So this topic is one that I've been given some thought for some time, and there's actually scarce literature on this. But last year, an academic and strategy consultant in Europe, Andrew Chakoyan, wrote a piece entitled "4 Lessons in Corporate Diplomacy in the Age of Tech-Assured Transparency, Doing Well by Doing Good is bound to transform from aspiration of a few to an imperative of all. Corporate diplomats will lead the way," he said. And if you follow the barrage of media coverage and policy debates around technology and society these days, it is really hard to disagree. And yet most tech companies, including sophisticated ones, have not invested in developing the competencies and the organizational skills that are needed to succeed in the current environment. This literature on corporate diplomacy is mostly a 21st century phenomenon because many of the challenges, even though they have root in the 20th century, have really been exacerbated in the 21st. So today I'd like to explore the business environment global companies operate in, with a particular focus on tech companies, which is the sector in which I've spent a quarter of a century of my professional experience. But first, let me give you a bit of context. After the golden years of globalization in the 1980s and 90s, in the 21st century, and particularly after the global recession, we have entered into what Ian Bremmer calls the age of guarded globalization. In this stage, there's a very different flavor of globalization. It is slow moving, selective, and with a heavy dash of nationalism and regionalism. The trend, by the way, is only going to be exacerbated in the aftermath of the pandemic. So multinational companies are facing global legitimacy challenges. They're accused as engaging in tax avoidance, using low-wage countries for corporate benefits only, disrespecting privacy regulations, abusing consumer data, violating local community rights, exploiting natural resources, ignoring basic human rights, and employing too many lobbyists targeting national and international political decision-making processes for their own corporate interest. Although many of these challenges are not new, as I said, they have resurfaced and become more apparent during the last decade. So it is clear that expectations of business are changing as rapidly as the world around us, and that the tech sector must urgently focus on restoring trust in society, in themselves, vis-a-vis society. Corporations must find a way to lead was the consensus view that emerged from the 2017 Edelman Trust Barometer. 75% of respondents agree that a company can take specific actions that both increase profit and improve the economic and social conditions in the community where it operates. A contemporary CEO cannot afford to ignore this sentiment. The era of corporate social responsibility as a cost of business has passed, and the era of doing well by doing good is upon us. Nielsen, a marketing company that popularized this concept, predicts that doing good henceforth might become a prerequisite for doing well. A successful business today needs to develop a genuine narrative that congruently articulates the value for society this business creates, defines what leadership philosophy is and what the company stands for. And then it must demonstrate to its stakeholders that it means to live by it in real ways, that this is more just than a PR messaging stunt. This way, the business can earn what some have called a social license to operate, which is the ongoing acceptance of a company or industry standards business practices and operating procedures by its employees, stakeholders, and the general public. A social license to operate is created and maintained slowly over time as the actions of a company build trust with the community and with other stakeholders. Doing this will require new leadership skills that are rare today. And we will discuss later, the external affairs departments of technology companies, or sometimes called corporate affairs departments, are best positions to lead the way to help these companies connect the synergy dots of public and private value creation. Andrew Chakoyan, that I mentioned before, cleverly started his piece by referring to a story according to which in ancient China, physicians were paid a retainer fee as long as their patients remained healthy. But if you became sick, the fees were suspended until and unless the doctor could bring you back to health. What a concept. The key to corporate health and longevity is preempting problems rather than firefighting. Yet we've built muscle and capabilities to fight fires and very, very few capabilities to preempt the problems from arising. Even the most value-driven company needs at least 3 important stakeholders: customers, employees, suppliers. These traditional market stakeholders, of course, matter quite a bit, but it is the relevance of the non-market related stakeholders that is noteworthy. On the government side, tech companies must contend not only with disparate regulatory approaches to the same issues on a global basis, but in some cases, conflicting approaches that they have to manage on a global basis. Companies have to contend with the rise of activism, not only from the traditional sources like NGOs or civil society, but also their own activist shareholders, and in some cases, their own activist employees. It used to be that a tech company's product development process was simply think it, build it, box it, ship it, and then repeat. Tech companies also prided themselves that they would move fast and break things. Well, in the modern world of cloud computing and internet app services, where software sales are not a one-time box sale transaction, but ongoing relationships, user experience and customer loyalty and trust are as important as product differentiation. Trust is an indispensable prerequisite for success. In a sophisticated tech company, the responsibility to maintain healthy stakeholder relations often falls with the external affairs or corporate affairs departments I mentioned before. And in a recent study, McKinsey looked at reinventing that function. And the research they did suggests that most executives recognize the necessity and importance of stakeholder engagement. That's the function's core mandate, is to engage with stakeholders. Yet the surveyed CEOs also reveal that their organizations still lack the external affairs capabilities they need to succeed. Furthermore, respondents reported little progress and even declines in the strength of their company's capabilities since 2012. For years now, our daily news have been full of evidence of the rising importance of these issues, not only for the tech sector, but for society as a whole. The breadth and depth of these global challenges is truly staggering. So I spent some time trying to collect just a few of my favorite issues and headlines. Environmental sustainability issues. This is an employee walkout staged at Amazon headquarters in Seattle. Climate change. Facial recognition technology and its implications for privacy. government surveillance, net neutrality, support of government censorship, security, hacking, ransomware. Just this week, we learned about the hacking of multiple verified Twitter accounts, which apparently was accomplished with some inside help from a Twitter employee. Data localization, especially in countries with less than stellar privacy track record. International data flows. Just this week, a major decision by the European Court of Justice struck down the EU-US Privacy Shield, the agreement that enabled the essential data flows between the two countries across the Atlantic. Law enforcement access to digital personal data, concerns about overreaching orders and the secrecy of the warrants that law enforcement agencies sometimes provide to tech companies. Artificial intelligence regulations and the implications for society, a whole range of issues from discriminatory algorithms to other kinds of biases built into those algorithms. Digital taxation and the transfer pricing structure that companies use to plan their tax payments around the world. Foreign interference in election and the leveraging of technology, data, and social networks in order to accomplish this. My personal favorite, online platform neutrality, self-preferencing, app store policies, and its conformity with antitrust and competition law principles. Data aggregation through company acquisitions, as well as market leveraging. The gig economy, the rights of employees, in the cases of this new tech companies with gig economy business models. The disruption of small businesses, mom and pop shops by online platforms. Cyber currencies like Libra or Bitcoin or others, and the regulatory and monetary and potential criminal implications of having unregulated currencies trading in the market. Gender equality and representation, and the gender pay gap in the context of the Me Too discussions that brought these issues to the forefront in the last couple of years. Sexual harassment and the company's treatment of people who are accused of sexual harassment, where they typically are given golden parachutes and paid this enormous amounts of money to have them leave the company. You know, this whole thing is beginning to change the way we perceive companies. The reputational impact and ultimately the business impact of these issues can be very significant. The other thing that's quite important is this new phenomenon. And if you look at the literature on stakeholder management, rarely you find references to the employees as stakeholders. And yet it is clear that employee activism is really become a significant check on the activities, particularly of tech companies. You've seen multiple of those walkouts. I've shown you images of the ones in the context of Google and Amazon. Even in the context of the pandemic, there have been virtual walkouts by employees that had been staged, trying to advocate for issues that they care about. Racial justice, diversity and inclusion issues, and racial pay gap. These are things that obviously we've been dealing with in the last few months in the United States as a result of cases of alleged police brutality and the actual killing, in some cases videotaped and shown to the world of killings of Black Americans by police. And then the role that social media and technology companies have, not only in terms of how they communicate about it and how they moderate the debate on these issues, but also the way they themselves are structured and the representation within the companies themselves. And that leads to this issue that is one of the thorniest issues that we're facing today, which is this notion of content moderation. Issues ranging from free speech, hate speech, political advertising as a form of speech, platform censorship, and areas in which, frankly, there's a tremendous debate in society over the proper role of these technology platforms in moderating and somehow curating the content. And whether some believe that they should opt for a free speech approach, others believe that they should take a much more active role in curating and scrubbing the content on their platforms. Now, I don't really have a talking point for this slide. I just wanted to give you a chance to breathe and relax after all of that. My heart rate goes up after I think of all these issues, because these are issues that I actually have to think about almost on a daily basis. This is all heavy stuff. And each and every one of those topics is complex by itself. Just imagine trying to find the right answers across different countries around the world, across cultures, across religions, different senses of morality. And society is asking corporations to find the right answers to these things with little or no guidance from the law or legislators or international treaties. These are areas that haven't been legislated or regulated. These are very active discussions with tremendous divisions on opinion, and yet we expect corporations who have not been elected by anyone to any kind of office to make these decisions on these critical issues to society. On this issue of content moderation on online platforms like Twitter and Facebook, YouTube, and others, think about it this way. Everyone has a different level of tolerance and or definition of what they believe may be offensive or abusive. Every individual has a perspective on that. This may be influenced by a lot of factors, where you're from, cultural norms or considerations, religious beliefs or non-beliefs, life experiences, language differences, etc. There's a patchwork of ever-changing regulations around the world, a patchwork of laws even at the state level in the US. Expressions that mean one thing in one country mean something totally offensive in a different country. And in the background of all of this, you have people who are intent on abusing and gaming that system. There are bad actors out there, like you are going to find in every time there's an opportunity to do that, to misinform, to manipulate, to profit from the situations. These bad actors are constantly evolving their tactics, and their trends are always changing. So I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that, at least from the point of view of this technology and society issues, the world is literally and figuratively on fire. I mean, they're extremely polarized view. Tech companies are charged with writing one set of policies for hundreds of millions of different people, billions of people around the world, who all have different definitions of abuse and thresholds of their tolerance. It is really impossible to get this right and make everyone happy. But not only do we have to deal with all those things, tech companies have to do that essentially as they're building these new products and these new services, which in many ways are just in the nascent stage of their development. So they're essentially building a plane as they're trying to fly it. Just imagine the scale of the complexity here and what's at stake, not only for the companies themselves, but for society as a whole. So today's corporations are often well geared to fight legislation that negatively impacts them. They know how to lobby. They know how to try to kill a legislative initiative or to try to push one. But that alone is no longer sufficient in this world. Focusing on common ground with governments and other key stakeholders might really reveal new opportunities, which otherwise would be obscured if the framing of the public-private relationship is just that contentious adversarial process. So how does one begin to address these challenges, and who can lead the charge? Now, I've said external affairs and corporate affairs, they aren't uniformly organized. They're called different things. They mean different things for different companies, but usually they include departments that cover communications or public relations, government and regulatory affairs, public policy, corporate social responsibility. These teams are the ones that are charged with corporate diplomacy. Michael Watkins defines corporate diplomacy as the role senior executives play in advancing the corporate interest by negotiating and creating alliances with key external players, including governments, analysts, media, NGOs, etc. In the tech world, the gold standard of corporate diplomacy is perhaps somewhat ironically embodied by no other than Microsoft. And who I believe is its secret weapon, its president and chief legal officer, Brad Smith. I think it is useful to think about the archetypical corporate diplomat because it helps us really grasp the contours and the potential impact that the function can have in the corporate environment, particularly in the tech world. Brad is someone I've had the privilege of working closely for and with for almost 18 years, including the years of the antitrust battles on both sides of the Atlantic, but also the years during which Brad helped lead the remarkable transformation of the company, more recently under the tremendous leadership of Satya Nadella, its CEO. Microsoft's experience and transformation is a valuable lesson for all of us in the technology sector today. Last year, Brad and another Microsoft employee, Caroline Brown, published a book entitled Tools and Weapons, the Promise and the Peril of the Digital Age. In the book, they recount how Microsoft found itself in some of the thorniest tech policy issues of our time and the difficult, often high stakes decisions they had to make. In the foreword of the book, Bill Gates talks about the role Brad played in persuading him and others that a new approach to stakeholder management was necessary if the company was to disentangle itself from the conflict with governments and competitors that had plagued it for the previous decade. Bill in the foreword says, in the early days of Microsoft, I prided myself on how little time we spent talking about people in the federal government. I would tell people, isn't it great that we can be successful and not even have an office in DC? As I learned the hard way during the antitrust suit, this was not a wise position to take. And then he goes on to say, after the case was settled, Brad persuaded me and a lot of other people at Microsoft that we needed to take a different approach. We saw that we needed to put more time and energy into connecting with different constituencies, including government, our partners, and sometimes even our competitors. Brad would have made a great diplomat, he said. Now, during his interview for the role of general counsel, where he interviewed with Bill Gates and other people, Brad showed up with a single slide that essentially declared that Microsoft needed to make peace with its foes. The slide said something like, it's time to make peace. At the time, Microsoft was widely seen as a bully. Changing the company's legal stance in the antitrust case, as well as later legal stances the company has taken over the years and continues to take not only in legal, but a number of societal issues, has helped the company soften its company's public image to the point where they're really regarded to a certain extent like the adult in the room, the conscience of the tech industry. You can hear directly from Brad in this BBC interview about his take on the role the antitrust battles had on accelerating the development of this approach.
20 years ago, Microsoft was fighting not to be broken up. Today, it's got the biggest market cap in the world, and I think in your book you argue that perhaps you're the best placed, the big tech, to deal with the regulatory pressures that are out there. In retrospect, do you think it was a good thing that that happened to Microsoft?
Well, I don't know that it was a good thing, but it was definitely both a humbling experience and ultimately a learning opportunity. We took away from what was a very difficult time. I think a real sense that we needed to step up as a company. We needed to understand the concerns that other people had about us. We needed to change. We needed to mature. And I think that has, in fact, served us well. I think there are some lessons to be learned that are probably applicable to more than ourselves for the future.
Now, but even a consummate corporate diplomat like Brad occasionally has to stand on principle to prove that its position is more than just PR spin. Tools and Weapons recounts the time when the Snowden disclosures came out and how Brad not only took the decision to sue the US government, but then pursued an industry-wide effort to limit the damage. The purpose of the lawsuit was to challenge the gag orders issued by the FISA court that prohibited Microsoft from telling its customers that Microsoft had received a warrant for the customer's data. So Microsoft was being forced to turn over personal data, and the customer never had any news that this has happened, nor did they have an opportunity to present any defenses or any arguments in the case. Now, given the history of litigation between Microsoft and the US government, just imagine how difficult it was for the company to decide to voluntarily file a lawsuit against its own government. But Brad understood that restoring trust from Microsoft customers was essential to Microsoft's success. It's not a question about being nice. This was a question of achieving the essential rebuilding of the trust that a technology company in general, but Microsoft specifically, needed from its customers if it was going to succeed from a business perspective in the long run. So at a time when tech companies were being accused of acquiescing to overbroad personal data sweeps by government, it was important for Microsoft, and it was important for the technology industry to stand up to those things and prove to customers that they would protect their data with the utmost zeal. Now, unbeknownst to Microsoft, Google had filed a similar challenge around the same time. And then the next thing that Brad did was quite significant. We talked about challenging the US government, but then the other thing that a corporate diplomat knows how to do is he or she knows how to work with the company's competitors in order to achieve things that are of business and societal value. Brad picked up the phone and called his counterpart at Google, Ken Walker. Here you see them talking to one another to explore whether the companies could gain strength by working together on a settlement with the government on data collection. The overture was remarkable considering, the history between Microsoft and Google, what ferocious business rivals they were in an industry where competitors were not really used to working together like you might see them in some other industries, including in the tech industry, like telcos and others, where you see much more cooperation than you see them in the software industry. But the two companies, because of the leadership of these two individuals, really put aside their hostilities. And they and other technology companies reached eventually a deal with the Obama administration that brought the litigation to an end. Now, to illustrate the age, the kinds of things that Brad would do in terms of creating this narrative and being able to be an advocate out there, not only for Microsoft, for issues that are important to the industry, I have a number of things that I want to show you. He's really out there on the speaker circle. Here you see them in Congress testifying in the context of the Electronic Communications Privacy Act of 1986 and advocating for some amendments. What you see there is showing one of the early IBM PCs and a floppy disk to illustrate what the technology looked like at the time when the ECPA, the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, originally enacted, and as a way of visibly demonstrate how antiquated that legislation was in the context of the technology advances of the time. You see them talking about technology and society in important media forums. You see them talking to Trevor Noah about some of these issues. You see him recognized as not only one of technology industry's most high-profile commentators, as this article says, but really the statesman of the technology industry. He's laid the groundwork for what he calls a digital Geneva Convention to really put restrictions and create an international agreement that would restrict nation actors from actually compromising personal data of individuals in the context of their cyber war scenarios. You see him here really taking a different approach that many other companies take when it comes to employee activism. In the case of Google, the company shut down weekly meetings with its employees where they used to be able to share their views once they saw signs of this activism and the tone of the conversations changed. Brad instead came out publicly and he said that the company welcomes employee dissent and says other tech companies don't listen to the employees enough. He said, every time we hear from our employees, we have the opportunity to learn. It doesn't mean that we'll necessarily reach the same conclusions, but we do get smarter. This is an excellent example of stakeholder management and really building bridges and relationship with all of those essential stakeholders. Now, you see, how is it possible? What has Microsoft done in order to achieve this goal? And is not just that they have a remarkable individual in Brad Smith personally with a tremendous foresight and a tremendous command of history that allows him to provide the context around the issues that we're facing today. Like, he's created what's called Microsoft's Digital Diplomacy Unit, which are policy experts who work on everything from the ethical use of artificial intelligence to protecting the 2020 presidential election from foreign cyber interference. This is the kind of focus that a sophisticated company will take. So in closing, whether companies like it or not, they cannot afford not to deal with the interests, the institutions, the ideas, and the rules that are outside their strict market domain. Corporate diplomats manage systematically and professionally the business environment in such a way to ensure that business is done smoothly. That is to say, with an unquestioned license to operate and an interaction that leads to mutual adaptation between corporations and society. The central theme of corporate diplomacy focuses on the question how companies can meet the social expectation of society without sacrificing their mission, which is to generate a profit by satisfying market demands. Companies, and especially technology companies, will ignore the demands of the time at their peril. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Horacio. This is a topic that I think we could talk about for hours and weeks. And Horacio has summarized it very nicely for us and given us an amazing overview of what's going on. And I think, I don't want to take too much time because we are going to go ahead and announce the next speaker, but there's some points that he made that I really have to cover. There's a new role for the private sector. The private sector did not want that role, but the private sector has that role, especially the technology companies. No one went to school, nobody studied to get to the point where you are in these leadership positions and you don't know what to do. We're used to having solutions, we're used to having answers, we're used to looking at others for answers and doing our job. This is not what's happening today. What's happened today is the technology companies, specifically the technology companies, but businesses everywhere are having to make decisions that they are not able to make. And they have to face challenges and decide what laws to break. We have laws that compete and conflict with one another. Why? Because our approaches to security, our approaches to fighting global threats differ. And our approach to privacy is different. This has created a tremendous amount of stress, and executives around the world are wondering, how do I deal with these hefty penalties? How do I deal with criminal liability? I don't want to go to jail, especially for issues where there is no solution. So what Horacio has talked about is something that Brad did, which is originally the tech industry was on the defensive and having to fight and explain that the issues of noncompliance, or try to explain why they were taking the steps they did. And what Microsoft did was it placed the tech industry on the offensive. They stood up and said, electronic gag orders, these search warrants, we need direction. This we will continue to see because, as we all know, the EU-US Privacy Shield was just invalidated on July 16th. We don't have time right now to talk about that, but that's huge. The invalidation of the Safe Harbor Agreement in October 2015 because of privacy affected our multinationals. We then had the umbrella agreement, and then we ended up with this privacy shield. It's something we really need to talk about. We don't have the time to talk about it right now. What's important, though, is trust and integrity, building those foundations of trust and integrity, because in a world where we have an ever-changing security landscape, we need to know who to turn to. And that's the reason we have this series. That's the reason we have this leadership forum, so that we can put industry leaders here to speak and to say, heads up, it's not our fault. And so that we have regulators saying, this is a direction. This is where we need to go. We need this interconnectivity. We need international cooperation. It's the only way to get through this. It's the only way to get through other global threats that are borderless. My next guest, the special guest that we have for today, is Lucian Cernat. Just like Horacio, who is speaking on corporate diplomacy and the importance and how certain individuals in the tech industry have stood up and taken this role, not because they wanted to, or maybe they did, but the fact of the matter is they're there. And this is the new role for the private sector in this world. Lucian Cernat, he is the head of global trade and policy and international procurement negotiations. How timely is that? He is with the European Commission, and he is going to explain to us the need for this inter-cooperation, this interconnectivity that we have had. But what is happening now is the laws don't mesh. And what are companies thinking? What are we going to do? The global pandemic has really scared a lot of us. Our supply chain, what's going on with the global supply chain? Lucian is here to explain and provide guidance for board members, for executives, and for our global community. Please tell us, Lucian, a little bit about the global supply chain and how you are handling it. First, I would like to introduce him so that he can say hello, and then we will play his video.
Hello, Adriana. Thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be part of your series, and I look forward to the debate with the other speakers. Indeed, we are perhaps living in extremely interesting times, to use an euphemism. We are actually, in reality, living through almost tragic times. Just think about the fact that in the US, and I sympathize with all the victims, in the US, we have had more casualties from the COVID-19 than the losses of American soldiers during the World War I. These are extremely difficult times on two levels. It's a global pandemic, it's a global health crisis, but also a global economic crisis. And as I am in charge of trade policy, and I particularly look at trade and supply chains, we are actually going through, as I said recently, through a trade apocalypse. And it's important for us to remain focused on what could be a solution out of the crisis, and that is the complex web of global supply chains that made us prosperous throughout many decades so far. We have millions of people who were lifted out of poverty from us working together along those supply chains. So it's very important that we don't give now into ideas that will call into question the importance of supply chains as a powerful force for recovery. So I think this is one of the topics on which we should perhaps exchange a few ideas in the next few minutes.
There we go. Thank you. Go ahead. We're going to go ahead and start the video at this time. Lucian Chednat, who is the head of global trade regulations and international procurement negotiations for the European Commission. And he will be talking to us about trade policy and the impact and the importance of trade policy with respect to our global economy. I'd like to first of all welcome Lucian to the program.
Thank you, Adriana. It's a real pleasure to be part of this series, and I think it's an incredible service you do to the international community to allow us experts around the world to interact and discuss issues that affect us all across all societies around the world. So many thank you for the invitation. So far, we've seen an unprecedented crisis from this global pandemic, actually a double crisis. We had a massive threat on our global health. We had multiple casualties. We've had massive fatalities around the world, in particular in the United States, and but also in Europe and elsewhere. But at the same time, also a massive economic crisis. It is one of the most severe crises we have had in recent history. It's probably the worst economic crisis since World War II. Even if we were to compare it with what was until now the most difficult time we passed through the economy, like in 2009, the global financial crisis, we see that even compared to that historical landmark, nowadays our economies have contracted even more. I think it's important for our listeners and viewers to understand the severity of this crisis, to have a quick look at one of the most important indicators that we at the European Commission have been using over time to understand the trends in our economies in the near future. So as we try to compare the evolution of our economic sentiment, it's called economic sentiment indicator, and it tracks the level of activity, of economic activity over time in several sectors. So you could see, for instance, here that since the beginning of the recording of this indicator, this is the worst moment in our history. Even compared to the great financial crisis in 2008, 2009, for most of the sectors that have been separated and analyzed in detail, industry, services, construction, and consumers, retail, trade, etc., you will see that in April of this month, the plunge, the economic severity of the crisis was unprecedented. The good news is that we see now in June, and hopefully this trend will continue, we see a rapid bounce back.
And do you think that will continue? We don't know.
We are, I think, dependent upon the fundamental parameter behind the crisis. Let's not forget that this is not a real economic crisis like the financial crisis. This is a health crisis. So in order to understand what's going to happen to the economy, we would need to keep an eye on the way in which you contain the virus, because I think that is the one that will have an impact on the economy. The reason why the economy went so badly, really off the charts, was because we lived for many months through what people call the Great Lockdown. Now we have starting to gradually ease those restrictions, and the economy is bouncing back because in many respects there was nothing wrong with the fundamentals in our economies. So it is encouraging to see that at least for a few months, if we manage to walk on this fine line of making sure that we contain the number of cases, that we shouldn't have too many new contagion cases, and we will have our health system able to cope with the pressure, which is still there, I think the economy will gradually recover. So we're confident that perhaps next year we will go back to positive economic recovery. So it's important to be optimistic, but also very, very cautious, and to make sure that we put in place all the necessary economic stimulus measures that we have actually already started to make preparations for. We have a very ambitious European budget with an unprecedented economic stimulus package. We live in exceptional times, and I think our European response has to also be exceptional and extraordinary. And having 750 billion euros ready to inject in those parts of the economy that need the most support, I think will put us on a positive path.
It's huge. I mean, I think about the countries that, you know, the emerging countries and you know, the developing countries. And, you know, and this is one of the big concerns, because this is, as you mentioned, this is like a war. This is affecting everyone, every country, and all sectors. And that is really what is different here. And unless we work together, there are going to be some countries, I guess, and some people that are more vulnerable. And, you know, it's a very, very difficult time.
I would like to fully agree with what you said about the impact of the crisis on the developing world. We've seen many developing countries being hit rather disproportionately in a way perhaps a bit later than us, but still in a very severe way. And there's one thing that we need to keep in mind is that for around 80 countries around the world, the EU market, the 500 million European consumers, are the main driving force for their economic prosperity as well. They depend on exports towards our market. And when our consumption collapsed, like the indicator I've just shown earlier with a massive decline in economic activity, countries who depend on the European market for their sales and their economic activity, they've also taken a huge hit. We are fully aware of that, and our economic response will try to the best of our ability to remain a global stimulus package. We do not want to stimulate our economy to the detriment of other economies. In reality, the first thing that recovered after the crisis was European imports. Our exports did not recover very well. Actually, our exports are still lingering in sort of a negative zone. My team predicted earlier on in May a -15, up to -15 decline in European exports. That's almost half a trillion. If you translate it into euros, it's about half of a trillion, 500 billion. And if you translate this into jobs, because behind these billions of euros of exports, there are real people with their jobs dependent on these sales abroad. We are probably, in Europe, we're looking at between 4 and 7 million jobs that are at risk. So we're fully aware of the real implications for many of our citizens from this crisis. And we're also aware that elsewhere in the world, other people are equally affected. But the good news, as I said, is that the first thing that recovered in Europe was consumption and also imports. So the first good news went from Europe to those developing countries that depend on us.
You know, you mentioned something very important, that this is unlike other crises that we've seen in the past, in the sense that it is built around the health. And if we can manage the pandemic and this great lockdown, we will be able to restart. And what you're indicating is really important, because any changes that you make do have ramifications on a global scale. And for your own business, it may not necessarily be the right steps to take. It may, you know, changing everything requires a lot of time and a lot of money. And unless it's necessary, that may not be the right way to go right now. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, indeed. I think to some extent, these open-ended questions are legitimate. We are in a pandemic and people want to draw the right lessons and be better prepared for next time around when such a global shock will hit us. And I think it's legitimate to at least ask the questions, but we should also ensure that we give the right answers and the correct answers. I think it's important to remember that before the crisis, we were living in GVC times, if we can call it that way, in global value chains, sort of globalized economy. Everything was part of a very well-oiled machinery with companies and countries specializing on the basis of their comparative advantage. We are all trying to make the most out of it, exchanging goods and services in order to make it more efficient for all of us and make it a win-win. So for many decades, this was a golden age for the global economy, where many countries, including developing countries, managed to lift millions of people out of poverty based on these global supply chains. I think there's probably no better way to explain how important was this mantra and this important philosophy of made in the world than to show, as I was trying to put in one of my slides, an iconic American product. Boeing is an American product made in the world. So here a chart, if you would take a screwdriver and try to disassemble a Boeing and its spare parts, and you would look at the label on each of them and say, where does this come from? You would see that many of the parts that are actually making such a fine product, a winner around the world, are actually made in many countries by many companies who work together in a perfect supply chain. Boeing, above all, is probably one of the best manager of a complex, very wide supply chain. You see on this chart, for instance, probably more names of companies that are outside America than American suppliers. I'm sure there are many other American suppliers, but this is just to say that it is clear that for complex products, we live in a world where supply chains were the norm. And that probably will remain the case, even though nowadays we hear people calling for nearshoring or reshoring or for having a plan B. These are all legitimate questions, but one thing in my view will remain as valid as before after the COVID crisis, that we will have to work together along supply chains. And beyond these company examples, I think what is important, and that's what we already did so far, was to ask ourselves, okay, we live in global supply chain times, but are these global supply chains resilient? Are they too concentrated? Are we vulnerable in some of these supply chains in a way that would require some corrective measures by the business sector or by policymakers?
I think that's a really important point because, as you mentioned, it's not only our Boeing airplanes, it's our blue jeans, to be honest. I mean, the American-made blue jean actually has the dye from one country, the thread from another, the buttons from somewhere else. I mean, what's important is for businesses to be able to map this. There may be high costs for non-delivery or where there are high penalties. And especially with the pandemic, what countries are having what issues? Now, your next chart is actually showing us how to do that. And I think that's another very, very interesting and very important part.
Indeed, I think even though we were confident that the global supply chains were a permanent feature of our trading system, because we were not faced with such a trade apocalypse. We had to go through such an apocalypse to actually ask ourselves some of the questions that probably we should have asked ourselves before. We probably did have some blind spots. Mm-hmm. The global supply chains were so well running, all oil. They really didn't have the need for any intervention. So policymakers probably did not feel the need to invest in the kind of things that I'm showing to you now. But in the crisis, we did have to ask ourselves to what extent our supply chains are subject to certain vulnerabilities. And here I use a very simple, very basic metric to measure vulnerability. If one particular product would be imported from a sole supplier, that would be a sign of vulnerability. If you have a plan B, if you have multiple sources of the same product around the world, if something wrong happens with one of your suppliers, you will always be able to turn around and probably source more from another source if you have it at hand. So here is a chart where we took literally all our products. In Europe, at this level of detail, we have around 9,000, a few more, 9,000, 10,000 products. So it's really the full spectrum of everything we import. So you see all the number of products on a vertical scale and then the number of suppliers. And the question is, from how many countries do we import each and every product in Europe? And the chart is very interesting in many ways. First, if you look at the bubble up in the left-hand corner, you see the number of products which are imported from a sole supplier, the ones I mentioned that as being probably the most vulnerable, for which our European companies have no plan B at the moment. So you see that we have roughly around 250 products.
Right here, right.
Exactly, right there. About 250 products which are imported from a sole supplier. But then you also see on the chart that the green line separates the product spectrum of all the imports into half. You have on the left-hand side products which are imported from less than 25 suppliers. That's 50% of our products in number. And then on the right-hand side, you see all the other products. And again, these are the other half of our products, which are imported from more than 25 suppliers, each and every one of these products. And there's another information, the size of the bubbles, because it's not just the number of products. You need to pay attention to the money. Mm-hmm. So you would ask yourself, is a lot of trade value subject to vulnerabilities? And that's what the size of the bubble shows you. And for instance, I single out the biggest size of our trade. You see the biggest bubble indicates the kind of products which account for the largest share of our trade. And you see that for more than 10% of our trade value, we source these products from between 60 and 70 suppliers. So the bottom line, the main message of this chart is that by and large, our European supply chains are well diversified.
That's great. This is
we have some vulnerabilities potentially for a very small number of products, and they represent less than 1% of all our imports. So we shouldn't be too concerned, but at the same time, we cannot be too complacent. I think we need to understand the nature of these products, whether they are critical for our supply chains, and that's the next step in our analysis.
And this is actually something that an executive or a company or especially the board would want to see for every single piece of your product. You know, if your product is not in Europe, if it's somewhere else, you want to know exactly this type of information. It's very, very helpful, very useful to understand where your risk is.
Exactly. If I were the chief economist of any multinational, this is the chart that I will show to my CEO immediately. And not only this chart, I will say, look, I plotted all our suppliers and all the products we need for our production system to function. If just to give you a very concrete example, because it actually affected many companies, a natural experiment which was similar in the kind of shock that affected global supply chains like COVID was the Icelandic volcano. I don't know if you remember when the Icelandic volcano erupted. That was a huge disruption for those supply chains that relied on air transport. So many of these automotive global supply chains, the automotive sector is one of the most globalized, the most dependent on such supply chains. The automotive sector, particularly in Asia, relied for some very small but essential parts on small suppliers in Ireland. And they were shipping this particular small, it was an airbag sensor in one of the newspapers articles I read. These all airbag sensors were actually produced by a small company in Ireland, and they were shipped by plane whenever they needed to a Nissan factory in Japan. But when the Icelandic volcano erupted, the planes couldn't fly anymore. So a very tiny component for which at the time, the Japanese automotive industry had no plan B, as far as I could tell from the newspaper article. They thought it's a small component. They didn't care about a plan B. And yet, because of the airbag sensor, the whole car was actually stopped. The whole production process had to be stopped. You cannot drive a car without an airbag sensor. So this is what people have to understand, that it doesn't matter so much the value of your components. You need to have alternative supplies. You need to understand the risk. And companies who invested in these kind of natural disasters, the electronics industry is another example, with some companies being very diligent, other being a bit more casual about it. Those who invested in a plan B, in a risk management, as you said, in fact, they recovered much quickly and they didn't lose so much money.
That's extremely important. And I think you don't want to start looking for a plan B when you're in crisis. And every single company is going to be different, because what's an important widget for you may not be for somebody else. So you really need to understand your product, understand your sensitivity, and how that will impact that product.
Yeah, I think, Adriana, you really nailed it very well. You hit the nail on the head, because it is really this firm level specificity that makes global supply chains critically important. And you cannot understand global supply chains if you start aggregating and if you talk in generalities. And this is why I've been advocating for a while a new approach to trade policy, which I call trade policy 2.0. which should actually rely to the largest extent possible on firm level trade data. And even though you may need at some point in a critical time to rely on a plan B, if you have firm level, very good firm level data, information about the real companies, the most adequate suppliers, you would be able to jump and bounce back very quickly out of a crisis. And I have three examples, recent examples from the COVID crisis, where we apply this trade policy 2.0 logic, but also encouraging signs from the United States and China, who probably, without calling it that way, they've also adopted the trade policy 2.0 example. So in the European context, what we did was, when the crisis hit us at the peak of the pandemic, many of our hospitals and national health authorities, there were many shortages of COVID-related materials. It could be protective equipment, it could be ventilators or test kits. So we at the European Commission were not mandated historically to do such things, but it was a force majeure. It was an unprecedented situation. So we wanted to help by actually identifying alternative suppliers, since the ones we knew of, they were overwhelmed with demand and they couldn't actually produce as much as people wanted of masks or ventilators. So having access to firm level data for other purposes, we re-engineered and we used that data to identify alternative suppliers. And we gave people who wanted to buy masks in our procurement department, we gave them dozens of names of companies who in the end were reliable suppliers. So I'm really hopeful that the kind of trade policy approach, this very detailed firm level trade policy approach, probably saved a few lives in Europe. And I'm very proud when I think about it. We realized that at the peak of the pandemic, countries had a kind of knee-jerk reaction. They put in place barriers and they started to segment the market. Instead of relying on supply chains, they all became national. And that made the problem even worse, because if you try to buy products from abroad, nobody is an island. Nobody can produce all the products that you need at that time. So we need to help each other and sell what you need, and I buy from you what you need, etc., etc. So now we have a global health initiative, which we have launched at the World Trade Organization. And we really want countries to understand the importance of keeping the markets free at the time when there is no crisis in particular, because this is how you build a solid basis. And all these suppliers have the confidence that they can also sell abroad and they can scale up and invest in productive capacities. And of course, it's not just about tariffs, it's about standards. You want to make sure that your thermometer or your medical equipment fits with everything else you have in the hospital. In the world of trade, another promising technology that was brought to the fore more prominently after the crisis is blockchain. Because blockchain gives you the trust. There are many players in the supply chains, both public and private companies, custom officials, regulators. They all need to trust each other and to ensure that products are safe for you and your family. So the EU blockchain for trade solution, in a way, if you wish, tries to ensure that we would have this trust and compatibility from global factories to your family. So
love the concept.
We really hope that the platform, which is going to be available for free, now we're in a pilot phase. It's far from being up and running on a large scale, but I wanted to also publicize it here with you and our audience, since I think blockchain is like, it takes two to tango. It actually takes more than two to do a blockchain. So we want people both in the private sector, but also different trading partners and different authorities to show interest and to allow us to create this global public good. We want this to reduce the cost of doing trade and increase transparency and trust. So reduce cost, increase transparency, increase ability of even smaller companies to participate in global supply chains.
And it makes it easier for smaller companies. Something like this actually is global. Exactly. So, well, hopefully when COVID is over, we will make it across the Atlantic, and we will visit. And I love what you do, and if we'd love to have you on again.
Thank you very much, Adriana. And once again, I would like to congratulate you for the initiative. It's really one of these platforms where people can get together and exchange ideas that hopefully will make the world a better place.
I agree. Thank you. Okay, wonderful. And we are back. Lucian had some very, very important slides there, and I will make those available through our website. If anybody is interested in those slides, they can go to the Price College website under OUG RTS, and actually all of our slides will be available for those of you that are watching and are interested in that information. If you're interested in learning more about what he's talking about, there's also a blog. It's on ants, dinosaurs, and how to survive the trade apocalypse. I can send you that information. If you want to contact us directly, I will also make that available through our website as to where to go for that link. He brought up the point that no one can do this alone, and no one is an island. And that is a very important point, because right now we're sheltered in place and it's scary. And, while we are not out there and we are locked in place, we need to realize that we do have the internet. And this is something that, thank goodness, is there. We are able to order our food, our groceries. We're able to communicate with one another. And we're able to have this type of a leadership forum to share ideas on how we need to get through this together. If one is at risk, we are all at risk. And not one person, not one company, not one country can provide everything that we need at this time to fight this pandemic and to fight global threats. So international cooperation is so important. And that global supply chain, I would suggest that for companies and their boards to map out where your supplies are located. Where are they? Are they in, if they're in Europe, you've got the slides. But if they're somewhere else, you want to figure out exactly what is at stake. How are we looking? Each company has to look at this differently, but where are the high costs for non-delivery? And which countries have which issues right now? Because the pandemic is evolving differently for different countries. So you need to take a look at the territories where you're in and follow and see for your own company, which widgets, which pieces are important. And that brings us to the next person that we're going to be speaking with that deals with risk. Risk management is very, very important today. And a lot of people are saying, well, not really. We really need to focus on the pandemic. Well, part of the pandemic is looking at your risk, figuring out exactly where your costs are, where is there a high chance of non-compliance, and finding ways to protect against that risk. The individual that we have next is Aon's Chief Commercial Officer for IP Solutions, and he is going to be talking about protecting your company's IP, intellectual property, during uncertain times. His name is Brian Hinman. He is not only Aon's Chief Commercial Officer for IP Solutions, he is also Aon's former Chief Innovation Officer. Brian is previously, he held the positions of Chief IP Officer for Philips and former VP of IP for IBM and for Verizon. Brian, I'd like to go ahead and turn this over to you now.
Sure, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
We hear you perfectly.
Oh, great. So thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. And I think, you know, this topic is one that kind of straddles the gamut of looking at opportunity and risk. And we're sitting at a very challenging time in the world, not just in the US economy, but in the world economy, because as you pointed out, you know, it's a distressed moment. Right, so you're seeing in my world of intellectual property, it's kind of like the perfect storm, because you're seeing a COVID environment whereby people are more mobile. So employees are working from home. It's a challenging environment to be able to interact with people. But then you're also coupling that with a distressed economy. And so then you're seeing strain on individual companies from an economic perspective. And so that puts into perspective a lot of different frameworks with respect to innovation. So really the first thing I want to talk about is innovation itself and how it really makes a difference in companies and really what's changed in this environment. So innovation can be translated into the world of intangibles. And that's really what I'm talking about here. So what do I say when I'm talking about intangibles? Really, there's been a fundamental transition in the world, I think, between from a regional manufacturing-based economy to a global innovation-driven economy. And what that has done is it's caused a historical rotation from a dependence on and a reliance on tangible to intangible assets. So back in 1975, for instance, the world was a different place. And if you look at the value of the S&P 500, for instance, you'll see that 75% roughly of the value of the S&P 500, which at the time was about 715 billion, was focused on intangibles, well, I mean, on tangibles, which is really property, plant, and equipment, and very, very little on intangibles, of which intellectual property is a large component. And the companies that were prevalent at the time were companies like IBM and ExxonMobil and Procter & Gamble and GE and 3M. Very, very tangible, focused companies. And then if you fast forward that to today, it's completely morphed and changed. And now companies are embracing innovation in a very, very large way. So what that means is that now 85% roughly of the value of that S&P 500 now is focused on intangibles, of which IP is the largest component of that. So now we're talking about roughly $20 trillion of value, which is really focused on IP. And the companies that make up the top 5 of those S&P are Apple, Alphabet, Microsoft, Amazon, and Facebook. All of these companies you're thinking about do a lot of virtual presence through online work, such as Facebook and Amazon. And so a lot of the intangible, you can think of that value versus having a lot of property, plant, and equipment. So that is what's happening. And so this, by the way, since 1975, that's a time span that included 5 recessions, not counting the current one. Intangibles have expanded during that time frame, and it's really caused a lot of value. And just to give you some examples of how that value is translated, I mean, it was Google purchased Nest in 2014, and that was for $3.2 billion. And a lot of the value that they achieved was from the patents, which really differentiated that acquisition. Rockstar was a consortium purchase between Microsoft and Apple and a bunch of other companies. Did a purchase of Nortel patents, which went bankrupt back in July of 2011. That was $4.5 billion. Microsoft purchased 800 AOL patents back in 2012 for $1 billion. So, I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Google purchased Motorola Mobility in 2011 that had a very, very strong patent portfolio for $12.5 billion. So the value is there. Companies are seeing it. And if we go way back into when the Patent Act was actually first started, this was back in the founding fathers in 1790 when the first Patent Act was formed. And it took 121 years between that 1790 and 1911 before we had our first millionth patent. And now we're fast forward to 2020, we're up over 10 million patents. So there's been a lot, particularly in the last 20 years, of innovation that's been captured through our patent systems worldwide. and also through all different forms of intellectual property. And the result of these events is that IP has emerged as a key asset class, which is a differentiation for companies that are trying to really substantiate that innovation. And unless it's protected, then it really sits there and you become very vulnerable. So intellectual property itself really consists of everything from patents, which I was just talking about, to copyright, which could be in the form of code, it could be in the form of publications. You have know-how that might reside in documents, it might reside in the minds of researchers. You've got trademarks, which is the power of the name, Coca-Cola and different IBM and Microsoft, very strong, powerful, valuable names in recognition. And then trade secrets, which has really become a very prevalent form of intellectual property, but one that's very, very misunderstood. Trade secrets is something that is not commonly known, and it derives independent economic value by the fact that it's kept secret. So you've got something such as the Coca-Cola formula for Coke, right? That has been kept secret, locked in a vault, and only a few people know the actual formula for that. And as long as you keep it secret and you do affirmative steps to keep that secret, then it becomes very valuable. And you don't have to register it, such as a patent or a trademark right. This is something that you just have, and it has value, independent value. So now, what does this mean for development, and really what does this mean for companies overall? And then I'll get into really what has changed with the current environment. As I've played my role in different companies such as Philips and IBM, where I headed intellectual property for these companies, and Verizon, and I also founded a couple of IP startups, it really played a role of defining within a company what the strategy needs to be to protect these innovations. And so really what it means is you have to have the right focus and the right culture and the right product development strategies and innovation thinking and R&D around capturing the innovations, capturing the ideas that fall into the heads of product creators, of R&D creators, and being able to go into and establish what is the right way to protect those. Should we be patenting? Should we be protecting through trade secrets? Should we be protecting through know-how? Or should we be publishing these and creating a standard in the industry? These are all fundamental decisions that companies have to make, and really combining to make what I call a portfolio strategy and a management system around doing this. But it starts from a cultural mindset from the top. So there has to be a CEO and a C-suite acceptance of the fact that you have to spend money to capture innovation. So you're spending money on R&D. Every day, companies spend up to 10% or more of their revenue on R&D to develop short-term and long-term development capabilities for their product and solutions. That's great. They're spending this money, but capturing that and coalescing that into these forms of intellectual property is very important, because then it protects you for the future. When we talk about risk, it's very, very important, and this is now where I'm going to morph into what's happening now with the distressed economy and with the COVID environment. Companies are forced to do unnatural things they weren't thinking about before. So cost management absolutely has got to be fundamental. So companies, if they've got a big portfolio like IBM that's got 50, 60, 70, 80,000 patents, Philips has 75,000 patents worldwide, and you have to think about cost assessment. So you're trying to assess the quality of your portfolio to making sure you're stressing the quality. At the same time, you want to lower your costs than the filing fees that it costs to maintain such a large portfolio worldwide, because you have to file in the US, and you have to file in Europe, and you have to file in Asia, and you have to spend all this money maintaining a portfolio. And unless you're looking through that lens of quality and trying to separate the patents that you have, which are lower quality, which you perhaps don't want to maintain, and so you might want to consider relinquishing that cost and either divesting or just abandoning those kinds of patents, and then stressing the ones that are high quality and really core to your business. And so cost management is really something that companies are thinking through and really right-sizing their portfolio and looking at doing pruning and sales of that portfolio. Looking at alternative capital sources. Companies everywhere from startups to established companies and public companies are trying to look at different monetization streams that they can use their intellectual property for. there's different forms now of IP-backed financing opportunities where you can actually use your IP as collateral for lending or for borrowing. And that's important because then you can actually see that value. You can value those assets up front, and you can obtain value through the lending community to try and tap into that value and being able to underscore that value and obtain capital either through debt or through an equity arrangement. And you can also monetize future royalty streams. That's another way to do this. So if you're licensing, I know when I was at IBM and also Philips and other large companies, they have active and proactive licensing strategies where they're licensing intellectual property such as patents and trademarks through brand licensing, technology licensing. You can generate significant amounts of cash to do that. And being able to monetize that is very, very important. So that's on the alternative capital sources. On the increased risks, I really enjoyed the previous speaker talking about supply chain risks, because this is very important from an intellectual property perspective too, because when companies such as IBM and Philips they sell products, they often have very sophisticated and very extensive supply chains where they have a lot of vendors coming in and providing inputs that provide different parts that go into the ultimate product. And as a result, these companies like IBM want to insist on having unlimited indemnification from these suppliers. So that way, if these suppliers have a third-party claim of patent infringement, then they are going to be able to absorb those through this unlimited cap that they're providing to IBM, such that it's not IBM's problem. The problem is that a lot of these smaller suppliers can't stand up to that, right? They can't, their creditworthiness isn't such that they can absorb a $500 million patent claim. And ultimately that patent claim, if they can't absorb it from the supplier perspective, becomes IBM's problem, or it becomes Philips' problem. That's the supply chain risk and the vendor viability risk that companies are having now. So it's something that companies really have to look at very carefully, particularly in this distressed environment when the creditworthiness of some of these suppliers might be suspect. Another risk is through IP infringement itself. So this is through looking through the lens of doing product clearances, or at least looking at your existing product and services set and understanding what is the risk of a third-party infringement claim. It's been shown that in the past 2 recessions, the IP market has witnessed 2 trends. One trend has been that patent litigation has declined initially when the recession started, but then accelerated rapidly into the recovery. And really what this is a factor of is companies are really looking at trying to recoup some of their losses and being able to go out and extract revenue through doing a third-party claim against another third party using the strength of their patents is a way that they do this. And as a result, it's caused patent litigation increases during times of distressed economy. And the other risk is that companies are spending much less on patents because, as I mentioned, they're having to curb the cost. This can be very dangerous because if you're cutting the wrong patents, that could be very, very troubling for you because then you're losing protection. If you lose patent protection, then others that might have third-party patents that read on some of the businesses or products that you have could become problematic for you. And so you have to be very careful on how you do this. So that's on some of those risks. And the other risk is, of course, employee trade secret misappropriation. In the COVID environment, as I mentioned at the outset, employees are having to relocate themselves, right? So they get laid off perhaps because companies are cutting back and having a series of layoffs. And so they leave their company and go somewhere else. And of course, what some people like to do is to impress their future employer, and they wind up taking things that perhaps they shouldn't have taken. And so that's called trade secret theft. And as a result of that, there's been a lot of cases recently, more and more every day I'm reading, where companies are going after these former employees and actually the competitors that hired them as well to recoup their losses on these trade secret theft cases. So that becomes a more heightened risk of these theft and misappropriation cases that companies have to think about. And then on a strategy perspective, from an IP lens, really examining some of the key innovation initiatives, companies are now looking at opportunistic M&A opportunities. So what they're doing is perhaps companies, the valuations have gone down in this economy, and it becomes an interesting opportunity for acquisitions. So a company that can acquire some of these smaller entities that are distressed, or perhaps the value has gone down, it might be a good M&A opportunity. And IP can be a very good differentiator to show an enterprise value such that a company is acquiring a company, but also the assets. And a good example of that, as I mentioned before, is say the Google acquisition of Nest. That was good because they acquired an ongoing company as well as one that had the ability to protect themselves through a very strong patent portfolio. So I think those are really good examples. So I think some of what we're hearing from CFOs, as I mentioned, is cost management is very important. Chief strategy officers that I talk to are really looking at different ways to examining hedging bets to make innovation prosper during times of trying to increase market share. So being able to focus on development and strengthening of this intellectual property stack of patents and trademarks and trade secrets to increase enterprise value as much as they can, which affects the bottom line, affects the share price. And so we're hearing a lot of that. I know the gentleman after me is going to talk a lot more about risk, but risk managers are a lot of the people that I talk to on a daily basis. And they're worried about such things as supply chain risks and some of these vendor viability discussions, some of the litigation risks as well, like IP infringement, and a lot of this disruption to the workforce. So as I mentioned, I think the message is fairly clear. I think intellectual property is a differentiator. It is a way for companies to develop a strategy to not only increase enterprise value, but also as a way to address the risks that I mentioned today. And the risks are becoming ever more apparent, especially in this distressed economy, particularly focused on the COVID environment. I think that, as I said, creates a perfect storm in a bad way with respect to intellectual property risk and risk in general for companies. But there are ways to mitigate that risk. Companies just have to have the right processes and policies and procedures in place to be able to culturally accept innovation and being able to capture it and being able to use it as a way to differentiate your company from others and as a way to help protect you from third-party claims. Adriana, that's pretty much what I have to say.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brian, for touching on all these relevant issues and making us realize that we not only have to look at this as what liabilities there are, but also as a competitive advantage. And that is something that a lot of companies don't think about, and they're trying to play catch up rather than being proactive. We also, you identified some strategic steps that companies can take right now, especially with COVID. And heads up, be careful, make sure you get those trade secrets,
Yes.
under lock. I would suggest, if you haven't already done so, create a contract with your executives, those key employees, and have them sign the appropriate agreements. I'm not giving legal advice here,
Yes.
but you might want to reach out to your legal department and just make sure that those contracts are in place, especially when you see that your employees and executives may at this point be concerned, and you want to make sure that you're protected.
Yes.
Okay, well, wonderful. We are going to go to our next guest, which is going to be speaking on the rise of the risk security intelligence. And this individual is Dr. Gerald Knight. He is actually based in the Netherlands, and he works for Coca-Cola Hellenic Bottling Company. His topic is basically a very relevant topic for COVID, but not only for COVID, it is for any crisis that we are experiencing. Gerald was formerly in his previous positions, he held several positions with the Australian government. So not only is he from Europe and working in Europe, but he also understands a lot of what's going on in Australia. He was with the Australian government, and he was also with the police force there. His topic will be on video because he's not available right now because of the time zone. So every once in a while, we have speakers in different parts of the world. It is hard for them to be able to come on. And in this particular case, we've got a video to show you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Gerald Knight, the Chief Risk Officer at Coca-Cola HBC. We're one of the largest franchise partners in the Coca-Cola system. I'd like to welcome you today to my presentation, which is titled COVID-19, the Rise of Risk Intelligence and Crisis Response. Firstly, I'd like to start by thanking the team at Price College of Business at Oklahoma University for their foresight in creating this Global Risks and Threats Series Leadership Forum, and I feel very honoured and privileged to be able to present to you today. The area of focus today will be on how the COVID-19 pandemic has changed business dynamics and driven many to re-examine and challenge their traditional thinking and approach to both risk management and crisis response. The concept of creating a risk intelligent business resonates now more than ever, and is a theme that emanated from the thinking that was published back in 2010 after the financial crisis in a book by Funston and Wagner called Surviving and Thriving in Uncertainty, Creating the Risk Intelligent Enterprise. Now, when I reflect back over the last decade, I've seen a broad spectrum of approaches having been adopted. Some that are purely in response to regulatory requirements, others being more dynamic, illustrating an understanding that risk intelligence can actually be a game changer, where the outcomes pay for themselves in the form of cost prevented from loss, together with revenue and profits that are generated through the taking of intelligent, or as I like to call it, smart risk. Today, I will look at the concept of risk intelligence and the drivers to create the risk intelligent business, together with the interrelated theme of crisis response against the backdrop of COVID-19. I'm going to argue that an enterprise needs to make fundamental step changes in these days ahead to ensure that they rise to the challenge and embrace concepts that enable them to effectively manage and respond to the ever-changing uncertainties in what has become an extremely complex and volatile world. But to start with, a few quick thoughts about COVID-19 and pandemic risk in general, which provide the impetus for this discussion. Interestingly, some commentators have described the pandemic as a black swan event, while in fact, I agree with the argument that it's not. And actually, Nassim Taleb, who wrote the book and coined the term the black swan, noted that it was a term that he used to illustrate the unpredictable, rare, catastrophic types of events. And it was meant to describe why in a network world, we need to change business practices and social norms. And it wasn't to be used as a cliche, and I quote, for any bad thing that surprises us. I'm fully aligned with that viewpoint, for in fact, the pandemic risk was predicted and appeared on our risk radars, but to varying degrees. If we look at the World Economic Forum reports, for example, they listed infectious diseases as the category that captures pandemics in their reporting for the several years. In fact, if we look at their reports from 2015 to 2020, we actually see a decrease in concerns relating to the impact, with likelihood of infectious disease not even being in the top 10. Additionally, in the past 20 years, our society has experienced a number of infectious diseases, such as SARS, MERS, and Ebola, and avian flu. So the risk has existed. It's been predictable. If anything, we failed to identify the true scale and nature of the risks as we have based our evaluation on what we have seen transpire in the past. The question this poses then is, if pandemic risk was on the radar, why then did risk managers and risk management not place the correct level of weighting onto the risk? Well, I believe collectively that governments, businesses and society in general we were lulled into a false sense of security as it pertained to pandemics. And we based this, as I said, on the past experiences without potentially referencing the changing world dynamics and the sensitivities that created an environment that was conducive to rapid virus spread. And that in fact underestimated the consequences, with the probability and impact ratings therefore reducing over time. Nor did we anticipate the level of virus virility or the velocity and momentum of the risk in respect to its emergence, and the nature then of what many would describe as some uncoordinated and disconnected government responses. What this illustrates to me is that as businesses, we need to step change our risk management approach and focus on continuing to build capability and undertake a journey that enables us to become risk intelligent. An integral supporting element to risk management is ensuring that crisis response capabilities exist and are practiced and effectively executed. As an observation, while many businesses have robust crisis management plans in place and they have their associated business continuity plans, in many cases they weren't tested against the backdrop of a rapidly moving global pandemic and in the context of the way governments may be unpredictable and inconsistent in their application of responses. So I believe we need to change our approach in order to raise the existing enterprise risk programs to risk intelligent levels. So today, I'll discuss resilience, risk, and crisis concepts and how they can protect value and generate growth for enterprises. In order to accomplish a shift in mindset and for enterprises to survive and thrive, I would argue they need to adopt and adapt to the new paradigm of business resilience, one that is not purely based on the traditional concepts of recovery, rather one that instills a culture that understands that in order to be resilient and to remain viable, they must implement what I describe as both proactive and reactive elements. Enterprise risk management, so the process whereby we understand our business environment, its uncertainties and opportunities, is a proactive component, and crisis management, which drives the response when adverse events occur, can be considered a reactive element. Ultimately, enterprises need to have processes and procedures in place that enable them to do several things and do them well. Enterprises need to be risk intelligent, and this entails understanding their risks and opportunities, adapting with agility to changing circumstances. They need to be supported by exceptional internal and external radar that detects changes in the operational environment. They need to work proactively to minimise their exposures and leverage opportunities by building strong functional collaborative networks, both internally and externally, and respond rapidly and decisively when there is an emerging crisis. These elements are interrelated, drawing together, as I flagged, proactive elements like enterprise risk management and reactive elements like crisis response. And in fact, as per the little diagram, this is the model that we have adopted at Coca-Cola HBC that sees all the elements led under one umbrella and led by me as the CRO. A key activity supporting this is to drive that collaboration and integration throughout the enterprise, driving the company to a strategic maturity and risk. At which point, once you reach strategic maturity, I believe you can argue that you're risk intelligent. The team focus, though, is on enabling growth while protecting the business. That is the key message, with the dual roles complementing each other. It's indeed important that we have a very strong cultural message supporting this, and that needs a strong tone from the top, and that includes all stakeholders engaged in the journey, from the board, the CEO, the executive team, throughout all management levels. And this needs supported, not only the tone, but needs to be supported by effective awareness and training campaigns that enable everyone to understand the role they play in taking smart risk and being risk intelligent. As I mentioned earlier, the concept of a risk intelligent enterprise and the way that helps to survive and thrive was discussed by Funston and Wagner going back a decade. Risk intelligence should be an ultimate destination in risk management ultimately, and is a state in which we address several brutal realities in an agile and active way that challenges conventional thinking and our business assumptions. Some of the barriers we face, though, can be a lack of agility, poor vigilance through ineffective internal and external radars, ineffective practices and procedures that are more regulatory focused versus being a business enabler, lack of a common language, a culture that is intolerant to fail and does not integrate risk concepts into the DNA of the enterprise. And then when things go wrong, our business continuity plans and our crisis response arrangements aren't potentially fit for purpose. So then how do we overcome these barriers? And there's a few examples on the screen. We can overcome this by creating a common language, one that everyone in the organisation understands and where they see it as normal for risk to account as a value driver and be actively involved in their decision making. We set a clear tone from the top to ensure that everyone knows that it's okay to take calculated and informed risk taking without the fear of failure and retribution in case you fail. As part of the culture shift, we educate all our people that discussions on value and risk are actually part of business management on a day-to-day basis. It's not a separate process. It needs to be core and fundamental to ensure that it becomes part of your evaluating processes, while at the same time protecting the assets that are in the organisation. This new mindset encourages them to remain vigilant for risks and opportunities while understanding the risk interconnectivity and the potential impacts from multiple threats, including low probability, high impact matters such as COVID-19. Ultimately, there needs to be a strong message that we are all risk managers. This isn't done just by the risk management team. We all have a role to play. That said, there is a role for functional specialisation, and this is where areas such as Treasury play a specific role, managing the risks that they may have, health and safety on their types of risk, because that enables the harmonisation, but it's all under one level of visibility, one level of collaboration that engages those key stakeholders. Because you've got to make sure we don't have a siloed mentality where everyone's working in isolation. There needs to be specialisation, but there needs to be coordination between all the elements to ensure the correct responses are in place. Lastly, as a concept, our people need to understand that turbulence is natural. And here we read in the word crisis. As businesses, we will experience crises. They are inevitable. So we shouldn't be put off by them, but we should see them as opportunities that enable us to respond within our risk management framework. It's important to stress, though, that one size fits one. It's not one size fits all, and we should leverage relevant standards such as COSO and ISO 31000s when we're creating the relevant enterprise risk management framework. Behind any framework, though, is the cultural change and the strong messaging, and I've provided some examples here of how we're doing messaging in CCH. And as you can see, we've got one that is about our function, what are we trying to achieve? And that really sends the message about enabling growth and at the same time protecting the business, be that our people, our assets. Then we have on the right hand side the smart risk logo, which really promotes the importance of taking risk, but taking that risk in an informed way. So in that way, we empower our people to be innovative and to grow. And I think ultimately, as you can see in the middle, we have a very strong message that we are all risk managers. We all have a role to play. And this, I've got to stress that at the end of the day, this isn't just academic theory. You've got to, in your cultural communications and your education, show real tangible examples of where the process is value adding. Ultimately, we want everyone to be engaged. We want them to understand the role that they play and enable them and empower them to take smart risks. By doing so, you become risk intelligent. McKinsey recently presented 5 ways to grow stronger out of COVID-19. I argue that the risk intelligent business ensures that risk sits as dialogue within each of these segments. It is an enabler for each of these activities. Each of the activities that McKinsey say we need to have in place as we emerge. You've got to have that thinking. You've got to have risk management embedded there. And the ultimate benefit of the process is that being risk intelligent is free, I would argue. It's something that's promoted in the book because at the end of the day, it's free in the way that it supports the revenue and profits that you can gain through ensuring smart risk taking that is aligned to strategy, together with minimising the level of cost that the business might incur due to losses if you don't manage or mitigate risks correctly, or when the trouble hits, that you don't manage the crisis effectively. So it's worth the investment because ultimately, as I argue, it's free. Having reinforced the importance of risk management in value creation and protection, let us focus in this last section on the importance of reactive element of crisis response. As you'll recall, I mentioned earlier that businesses today that want to be resilient and viable need to do several things, and they need to do them well. The last activity that I mentioned was the ability to respond decisively to a crisis. The reality is that events will be inevitable, and warnings typically do occur, but without risk identification and management, they're typically ignored. In fact, the nature of our response can generally dictate whether or not an event will become a crisis. The cost of ineffective crisis management can be both financial and reputational. For, as Warren Buffett notes, it takes 20 years to build a reputation, 5 minutes to ruin it. If you think about that, you'll do things differently. Preparing effectively for a crisis response requires us to understand the interrelationships between our ostensive and performative routines. And we need to ask ourselves the question, have we got the right approach? How do we come out of COVID-19, assess the crisis lessons, and in our preparedness, continue to raise the bar? Firstly, it's critical that we create effective ostensive routines, and they're the processes and procedures with the supporting artifacts or tools that will guide us in our deliberation and our response. Indeed, research has shown that crisis routines, which provide that response framework, are valuating because they guide teams towards the right direction. But it's important they do that in a way that does not stifle response creativity. We've got to make sure that we can minimise the process deviation because teams that perform best follow the routines while still remaining creative. Deviation, though, can be caused by a number of factors, and these can include the crisis leadership, the capabilities of the crisis leader, the composition of the crisis team itself, the cultural elements, both personality and business culture, together with not having the right level of crisis training in place that ensures that our people have the right skill sets and have been practiced sufficiently to enable them to respond accordingly. Team leadership, to me, needs to be a particular area of focus, as the best business leader is not necessarily the best crisis leader, because they have different skill sets, they have different personalities, and the nature of their role is quite different between what you're trying to achieve in a normal business world and what you're trying to achieve during the crisis response. COVID-19 has not only reinforced the importance of effective crisis response, but I argue challenges us as we come out of the crisis to re-examine our models to ensure that we have the correct crisis team structures in place, appropriately trained crisis leaders, and a readiness and a commitment to continue to invest in the development of our crisis teams. When we combine those elements together, we can step change and raise the crisis response bar even further. So the dynamics of COVID-19 have also seen our crisis teams having to adapt to manage cases virtually, where traditionally crisis teams in the past have been encouraged to attend in person in the war rooms, with some virtual exceptions. Our war rooms there were dedicated, they were a secure area, with our argument always being that face-to-face interaction drove engagement, dialogue, and information sharing. However, overnight we were sent to our homes, and this meant that as crisis teams we had to be agile, we had to adapt to this new norm, being able to do things faster and simpler, leveraging technology such as Microsoft Teams, changing our leadership styles in order to drive strong engagement and interaction while managing the emotions of our team members who are shifting into a new way of working. The role of the crisis leader, I would argue, specifically changed, as the role can in fact be harder in the virtual environment, as we as leaders need to be more directive than perhaps we would be in a normal environment or as experienced when we're all sitting around the table in one room. So it's important to engage all our team members in order to avoid any zone out. So that requires the ability to not only understand your team, but the technology itself and how to utilize that to its fullest, be that the strategies to share documents, the processes and the tools, interaction with teams, or the management, most importantly, the substreams that work in support of the broader crisis response. Ultimately, this experience reinforced to me the importance of training and skill enhancement, and indeed a need to focus in creating a more structured training environment and ensuring that we have a really robust simulation program in place. Well, in closing, I hope you found the session informative. I just wanted to give you a little bit of an insight as to why I believe now more than ever, it's important for us to become risk intelligent enterprises. It's a value add to the business. It's free because it will generate growth and it will protect the assets that we already have. And if we can illustrate that to all our leadership and change the cultural dynamics, we will all be able to attain that goal of a strategic risk maturity and being risk intelligent. Thanks for your time today.
Okay, that was another great presentation. I think it's important, what we're noticing today is this collaborative effort, this collaboration that we're seeing. We heard from Horacio this morning, basically saying how the technology industry, the technology leaders were getting together and collaborating because they have so many issues, so many challenges. And it's important that it's not only the technology industry, the technology leaders that are getting together, but here in this leadership forum, we are hearing from different sectors and we are hearing from different functions within those multinationals, and everyone is sharing. And we are realizing across sectors, there are different challenges, but we are all facing issues and we can learn from one another, these skills that are so important, especially during a pandemic. My next guest is Matt Addington, and Matthew is going to be speaking about the early warning intelligence, the early warning signals. We had Gerald talk to us about crisis response, resiliency, and management, and the importance of leadership. The importance of business leadership is different from crisis leadership. And that is a really important point. Now we're going to have Matt talk to us about the early warning intelligence. His background is he does cyber and he also does national security. He was a former DEA special agent and he was also with the CIA. He was a CIA operations officer. His specialty is narco trafficking, narco terrorism, and global security threats. Matt? Welcome. I think you are still muted. We are having some technical challenges right now, but that's okay. I'll let Matt figure that out for a moment and we'll just talk a little bit more about this. This type of event, we basically have the ability to build trust and integrity. We basically have the ability to bring people together and give you some strategic insights on how to manage those real world solutions. The rest of this series, we are going to speak with Chris Libertelli, and let's see if Matthew can fix his microphone, and if not, we can jump to Chris and then come back to Matthew. Nope. You talk to Keith. Keith might be able to help you with the technical sound. Let's see if we can turn to Chris. Chris, are you ready?
Yeah, I should be. Yes.
Okay. Well, I'm going to jump in then, and Matthew, we will come back to you, and let me jump right now to Chris and tell you, are you on? Are you ready? No, okay, you're getting ready. Okay, let's
be right there.
Okay, so let's get Chris. Chris is going to be talking about restarting network and ISP resilience. And He's looking at new risks and new methods for of working. His background is he was the head of global policy for YouTube. And before that, he was the global public policy leader for Netflix and formerly a senior legal advisor to the FCC. So we are going to jump in and we're going to talk with Chris at this point, and then we're going to come back and talk to Matt.
Great. Thank you very much. And thanks for the invitation to this group. It's a pleasure to speak to you today. A little early, but nonetheless.
Well, this is life, right? And we're in transition, we're sheltered in place, and emergent life happens, right?
Exactly. We're all our own IT departments in this global pandemic. And what I'd like to do is talk today a little bit about something that I've been working on for, I don't know, at least 25 years. And that is, how are these ISP networks holding up? If you look at most major organizations, particularly tech organizations, we're seeing a lot of distributed work. And so the question is, as employees distribute more broadly, and maybe we reach a new normal where there's just a lot more telework going on, are our ISP networks up to the task? Or did the performance of these networks actually pose a risk to distributed working? And as I was thinking about what I actually talk about today, I wanted to make sure that I didn't bias myself towards the negative. And so this is actually a good news story. And so what we'll do today is really three things: talk about how the networks are performed. Second, observe a technological change in the way these networks have architected that reduces risk. And third, offer a few policy thoughts that allow us to see around the corner to some new risks that are coming, both on the sort of public policy regulatory side, as well as in these networks themselves. So with that, I'll start by saying, if you look around at the research that has, and survey it, what are we now, 4 or 5 months into this pandemic from a US perspective, the news is pretty good. What you see is directionally a huge increase in the demand for bits, right? A huge increase to do Zoom calls, to stream Netflix, to stream YouTube, whatever people do online. And if you average that out, it's been a roughly 25 to 40% increase in that demand. Now that's a significant number. If we were talking today about how our electricity grid, for example, may have held up because we have 40% more air conditioners, I think policymakers as well as the industry might be a bit more worried about how our grid, which is particularly smart in the US, maybe in other places, could hold up under those circumstances. So I think the US has a particular risk on that utility side, but on the ISP side, it's worth observing that these networks really have scaled to meet demand by and large. It's a bit more uneven in Europe. If you look at the numbers coming out of Europe, my homeland of Italy has a 101% increase in aggregate demand. And the other thing you see, particularly this might explain why Italy at 101% with France at 40, as I said, it was roughly the same, the median number for this increase. There's a lot of activity on the internet when public policy officials make a change, right? Or give out some information about the pandemic or issue a stay-at-home order. And so if you chart the COVID pandemic, both here in the United States and abroad, and then you chart how this 40% increase in demand is aggregating, what you see is the pandemic chart, and particularly in the US, not so much in the rest of the world, is up and to the right, fairly steep. And what you see on the ISP chart in terms of demand is rising demand, peaking around public policy announcements, and then this slow settling into a stasis, a new normal, where Netflix and YouTube are making up roughly 75% of all the video bits online. And then Zoom and other interactive two-way communications are being highly used for remote workers. The biggest policy debate in the last, say, 10, 15, 20 years, as Horatio mentioned earlier, is openness, network neutrality. That legal debate is about whether the internet is, or the access networks to the internet are public utilities or something perhaps less regulated. I think one of the risks to some, opportunities to another, that's going to come out of the pandemic is there is a new normal around how important access to the internet is to get your work done. I have school-age children, and with distance learning, it's just not an option not to be connected. So, and this is a sort of a pivot into the second part of the presentation. The policymaker focus is going to be on these adoption gaps. That's a prediction for me. And whether you see that as a risk or an opportunity depends on, I think, where you sit in the ecosystem. But that is becoming more clear. I'm sitting in Washington, and there's sort of unfinished business from the last national broadband plan, and it all has to do with adoption. So I think that's what you're going to hear more and more of as we recover and as we reopen. There are still people not connected to the internet. The SEC judges that a roughly $20 billion problem if you were to use the existing support structures, universal service programs, et cetera, to fund that build out. And there'll be a big public policy debate whether new money should be used to actually close that gap so everybody can be presumed to be a remote worker. Now, one could ask, how did we do so well? Again, I think if the electricity grid in the United States were to go up to 40% demand, we might have some glitches. We didn't see that by and large, and why is that? And what I'd like to suggest is there's been a very subtle but very important change in the underlying architecture of the internet in the last, say, 10 years. And it is true that there are really two companies that are responsible for this subtle but important technological change in the way these networks are architected, and that's YouTube and Netflix. They account for roughly 70% if you use Sandvine's number of all the video bits. And both companies have been very forward-leaning and very, very investment oriented around building CDNs that are video optimized. And so these CDNs, these content delivery networks, one could have, is a crude analogy. You can think of them as the intelligence that puts video that you want closer to you, so you don't have to go to Singapore to fetch from a YouTube server. You can actually just go around the corner and get it from a cache server that's local. Now that's important because if my interaction on these networks isn't, when you think internet, you think global, maybe. I do at least. Well, it is, but if the reality is that these content delivery networks can pre-position content that they know that you want close to you, you don't need to use the backbone links. You can just bounce back and forth between a local cache server. And I want to posit that one of the reasons why, and ISPs have broadly interconnected with those networks. So the AT&Ts and the Verizons of the world are now directly connected to most of these CDN networks. And so that increases performance. It avoids costs for the ISP. So they see it as a risk reducer on the cost side. And then the big platforms see it as an opportunity to get their content quickly at a high quality to the end user. Now, I don't want to paint a super rosy picture because it's a very, like the pandemic itself, ISP conditions vary place to place. And so European policymakers did ask Netflix and YouTube to lower their standard definition bitrate to, just be cautious to ensure that we had enough capacity to meet demand. I think that was prudent at the time. I think there's an open question about whether such a throttling of quality is necessary. I mean, I'd like to think we're a country that lives in an infrastructure where high definition video conferencing is the norm on everybody's connection. That's not the case today. If you have a DSL connection, you might be challenged on a high definition Zoom call. So these CDN networks, I think, are really the untold story of why we've seen good network resilience. And if there is speed degradation, it's coming at this house, for example, there's a Fios connection here, which is a fiber connection with 100 megabits. So when you have that kind of upper limit, the throttling that might happen, for example, to Netflix at standard definition, et cetera, has a nice effect on aggregate demand. But in a 100 megabit world, if you have that connection, you're not going to suffer any of the risks of some of the problems in rural areas of experience in the United States, for example, on DSL lines. So generally a good story. It's not uniform everywhere. There are these gaps, and there are situations where, for example, CDNs aren't broadly interconnected, the performance will degrade. But by and large, I think it is a good news story. And I want to, as a transition to my third point, observe the biggest policy debate that I was involved in as I left government from the FCC was whether we should deregulate essentially the quality of service metrics on the phone network. And the argument for not doing it was, what about a pandemic? What about a national disaster? You've got to make sure that somebody is overseeing whether these phone networks are working. And there was some deregulation of that world, but when you look at how well the internet networks have performed in the absence of that regulation. I don't know that there's a compelling need for more of this quality of service reporting. In fact, I think that suggests that the industry is doing a pretty good job coordinating at forums like NANOG to deal with the availability of bandwidth in this COVID environment. A few thoughts in closing, just to sort of give folks some food for thought and maybe some visibility into the policy environment coming out of Washington and to a lesser extent Brussels. I haven't been there for obvious reasons lately, but I am here, and I want to reiterate that policy will shift. I think if a Democrat were to take the White House, probably more. If a Republican, probably less. But still, the trajectory is towards the recognition that remote workers need consistent access. The policy environment is going to shift dramatically on this one area, which is, do kids need special help to adopt the internet? Are there places where what Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel talks about is the homework gap? Are there places that policy can help with adoption, with the network itself? And I think you're going to hear a lot about the educational implications of remote work and getting kids online. If you have school-age kids, you're seeing the fits and starts of an online learning environment that really should be much more rich and engaging to kids, and it's not now. And that's really an embarrassment. I think we should be doing much better in terms of not missing a beat on this pandemic and getting our kids connected to the right educational platform. And then the final thing I want to say is, there's one thing about the internet that we can say is that change is the constant, and that somebody's always innovating the next iteration of a dense wave division multiplexer or something that will give homes even faster internet access. If CDNs were the kind of unsung sneaky hero of the innovation underneath the network, then we should be looking out for what's coming next that has a similar effect. And I'm going to suggest that, particularly with policy in mind, that companies like Starlink, which is the SpaceX lifted low Earth orbit 5G kind of like satellite service that is designed to reach these 20% areas, these areas not served by fast broadband fiber networks. And as those networks come online, you're going to have an interesting debate about whether the country as a whole has a risk of not having an infrastructure that allows for ubiquitous remote work, or do we need to, in fact, subsidize connections to things like Starlink? I would watch that space, because I think satellite technologies, particularly the ones that use lasers between satellites and use relatively low latency, and by that I mean less than 50 milliseconds per less, to rural areas at prices that aren't so exclusive that you couldn't imagine a farmer actually subscribing. So watch that rural-urban divide on the deployment question. I know more about the planning that's going on with the Biden folks than I do with the Trump folks. And there's a lot of policy thinking that's sort of like a resurgence of policy intervention. As I said earlier, that can be a risk or an opportunity depending on if you're a carrier or someone who uses networks. But it's going to be a busy time after the election, and hopefully the post-election environment will coincide with a national exhale and perhaps the reduction of general risk and the introduction of truly ubiquitous remote work to our new normal. So why don't I leave it there, Adriana, and happy to try to get us back on track.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chris. And I appreciate you jumping in early. That's another talent is to jump in and when you're called. So yeah. We've noticed that these are all excellent speakers, but not only are they excellent speakers, they're experts in their field. And it's very, very evident from everyone who has spoken just how much they know and how the insights that they're providing us are invaluable. We are now going to turn quickly to Matt Addington. His microphone is working. And as I mentioned before, Matt will be speaking on the early warning intelligence. He is a former DEA special agent and a CIA operations officer. His area of expertise has been narco trafficking and national and global security.
Thank you, Adriana. Can you hear me now?
I can hear
Are we
you.
good?
Yes.
All right, beautiful. Thanks for jumping in there. Early warning intelligence, wow, it's a monster topic. Very, very relative to this, as relative as it is to counterterrorism and global security and intelligence collection. And that's really where I want to focus a little bit of my comments, and I'll move through it quickly. I know we're a little bit behind, and I wasn't any help to that. But when we look at early warning intelligence, what are we really looking at? We're looking at indications and warnings, right? We're looking at things that can have imminent impact on a situation, an activity, a war, a requirement for a company, etc. There's a list of a million reasons why early warning intelligence is important and significant. It's defined, I like to read this definition because it's applicable to any country in the world and any individual. Indications and warnings, right, are those intelligence activities intended to detect and report time-sensitive information on foreign developments that are threats to a country or allied and or coalition military, political, or economic interest, or to a citizen. Now, what's interesting in that definition was I took out two words. I took out US in two parts of that definition, just to clearly demonstrate the application of indications and warnings and how relevant it was to pre-COVID and how relevant it is to post-COVID. You look at some of the reporting when you go back at November 2019, when some of the first reports, US reports, were being released, where words there was a report where they said a contagion was sweeping through China's Wuhan region. That's a basic intel statement, probably taken off a tear line with no substantive background information or additional intelligence. But then you had, the Military National Center for Medical Intelligence, right? NCMI, in December 2019. They were using words in some of their reporting like cataclysmic event. And the NCMI, they're concerned obviously about the global implications of something like a COVID that would have on NATO and military operations and troop movement and etc. Again, you can think very clearly about how many different applications there are to a system like that in an organization like NCMI. NATO has a system. They have the NIWS, the NATO Intelligence Warning System. They were picking up significant clues of things going on in the region, but yet the pieces weren't really coming together. Everybody knew there was a problem, and we all started to hear some of this reporting trickling out on the news and through social media. It's interesting with early warnings and intelligence. You really have to look at, with a global issue like COVID, every individual is a sensor. Every system, every social network becomes part of a global collection network. And that's really what early warning intelligence is, right? It's the attempt to gather all of this sensor data, aggregating all this data, and operationalizing it, right? Turning it into something that is actionable and that is timely, based on how quick you can collect the data and aggregate the data and make informed decisions. And we all know let me state that, and that comes in two forms, right? That comes in human intelligence, and that comes in signal intelligence. And then however you want to break that up, both are incredibly significant because each can be used to validate information received from either of those avenues. right? And it's no different in the commercial world as it is in the government world. You really ultimately have, when you're collecting that much data and that type of data, you have those situations where it's really a collision of government and commercial interest, right? They could be one and the same, but typically both are attempting to collect massive amounts of data to make an informed decision. So one of the questions that comes out of when you have these type of systems that are already in existence and multiple other systems collecting data for whether it's military or it's intelligence or it's global law enforcement sharing, whether it's through Interpol, whatever it is are the systems talking with each other? If not, why aren't they? Are we sharing data globally? Are we sharing data regionally? Are we sharing data locally, right? And have we made the investments in being able to take that data and aggregate it and do something with it that is for the benefit of a situation like COVID? I would say 9/11 is the perfect example of the failure. The pre-9/11 early warning system, we all know, failed. We had global collection efforts. We had multiple agencies collecting data. And we had pieces that, had they been brought together, would have almost clearly defined what the threat was, when it was going to happen, and how it was going to be executed. But we didn't have that. And we can use this in the COVID environment, because then in the post 9/11 environment, which I'll get into the post COVID threat intelligence collection requirement need, but in the post 9/11, we brought agencies together. We created task forces because we wanted to mitigate the risk of another attack. So has that worked? Well, from my experience and what I've seen, very quickly, it worked very well. Massive. We went from a situation where there was tons of data out there, but yet it wasn't being shared, so there wasn't enough data. We then went into the post 9/11 environment where there was too much data. We didn't have the systems that could aggregate the data and could break down and withdraw from the data the most pertinent, significant data, and being able to wash away the insignificant data. We were trying to deal with all the data. Those social and data scientists on this call, that will resonate well with them. So now we've gotten better at taking good data and trying to make sense of good data, but we still, in the post 9/11 environment, because of the way we are structured, the way the government's structured, the way agencies are structured, we still are not actively sharing a lot of significant data with each other. Sure, we're doing a better job, but still there are vested interests in organizations, governments, or individuals, and in this case, agencies within the US government, to hold their information. Budgets are tied to that. Economies are tied. Risk, you hear a lot about risk. Risk is a big deal when you're taking intelligence information and you have vetted it and you've done as much as you could do to allow that data to resonate with you as valid, right? And then you have to take and make that decision to report that information. That's the critical step, right? Which organization, which individual, which government, who is going to step up and actually take that risk, knowing that there's going to be economic fallout, there's going to be potential infrastructure disarray. There's again lists that we could come up with of the effects of those type of decisions based on the collection of early warning intelligence and how valid or validated that information is. And governments rely on, their agency and their agency reps. But it's interesting because in the COVID environment, when I look at threat intelligence and I look at the collection of threat intelligence, NGAs, for example, NGAs are all over the world. Individuals representing NGAs, they're all over the world. They are collecting bits and pieces of information all the time. And when you look at budget allocation in this post-COVID environment, you say, okay, where, in order to better collect this type of threat intelligence, and that's what it is, what do we need to do? What do we need to change? What do we need to develop? Where do we need to put the dollars in order to minimize the risk? And in this case, we do think of it as a US standard because we are here in the US, but let's be honest, it's a global standard. Where do we invest the money? NGAs are hard pressed begging for money, but do we invest collectively in tying them into a system, a communication system, an email type system, something that allows for the collection or the dissemination of information? And I would say, this is a broad statement, unbiased information, although we all bring bias when we report. But when it comes to things of this nature, and then we validate that information. It's interesting. You go back to 1993, the Federation of American Scientists. For those of you that are familiar with ProMed in 1993 was an email system that was constructed, was built by the Federation of American Scientists, and it was for monitoring emerging diseases and to be able to get that information out very quickly. In 2003, they were reporting on SARS as they saw it globally occurring. In December 2019, they actually reported some chatter out of China off the social networking site called Weibo. And there were comments being made about this spread of this disease. So it's things like that where we have to look at. There are a massive amount of reporting mechanisms out there, and the government looks at the government and other government agencies and some commercial entities to grab their data in order to make informed decisions. Well, what COVID brings to the table is this is new, this is global, this has such incredible global impact on the US government and any country in the world that the timing, I believe, is perfect, that we actually can create an infrastructure, a communication infrastructure that brings to the table a lot of disparate organizations that wouldn't get that play. We really have to bring together, from a data perspective, the CDC, the WHO, the NGOs, large commercial entities, government agencies, and we really need to move towards a more global task force focused resolve for this, where there is communication going on throughout all of these organizations, where we're monitoring and it cannot have the elements of politics in it. Of course, it will to some degree, but when we're talking about threat intelligence, and which is data collection on a massive level, you're talking about a non-political process, which is about saving lives. And so I hope that as we move forward, based on these lessons we've had through 9/11, major hurricanes, FEMA's another, the Red Cross. I mean, I go on and on of organizations that collect massive amounts of data that are all relative to being part of the threat intelligence, the early warning intelligence collection systems of the future. It's just going to take a global commitment. It's going to take technology, and it's going to take a non-political task force approach that kind of allows for this type of technical leap. I really enjoyed the comment about satellites, the small satellite program right now. I mean, the last SpaceX launch or a few back, I mean, they had 65 small satellites were being launched. 3/4 of them were for commercial application. And you get 3 satellites launched and they all speak to each other, and you're going to see some global advancements in this early warning intelligence collection of data environment. It's going to exponentially allow for us to be much better prepared for COVID or predict, right? Early warning is an attempt to predict before something happens, or at least mitigate the result. So I think you're going to see some large shifts, but unless we come together with advanced technology in cooperation with governments, I'll use this as an example. I'm not going to get on my soapbox. We don't have enough time, but whatever the criticisms of the WHO were or weren't, but it's a good example of kind of a who cares situation. It's like they had information and they passed it. And what we do is we care about the data. All the politics surrounding the CDC, the NGOs and governments and the posturing politically, there have to be those that are set aside that don't care. They want the data. We want to operationalize the data to help mitigate the risk of something like this happening again. And I'll just conclude by saying that it really does come down to a moral obligation when you're looking at intelligence data. And I've seen this happen where you have a decent amount of, call it classified, sensitive information, and somehow that call has to be made. Do we release this? What are the ramifications of releasing this data or this information? And that all has to be weighed. But when it comes to pandemic level medical situations of imminent risk globally, I think that's a decision that needs to be made with multiple partners and multiple individuals, all willing to take the risk together, which makes it easier to make those decisions to release that data. And we haven't even seen all the data, right? Which in and of itself says that, because I'm sure there is a lot more early warning intelligence that was out there prior to this that was not aggregated and was not brought together into a common system for some type of operational view. So I hope for the future, I hope that's where we go. There's a lot of individuals on this call who have a lot of access into the advanced technologies. I'm in the cyber world now, and I spend a lot of time working with the U.S. government and the intelligence community and DoD with regard to advanced technologies and cyber technologies. So I know the technology is out there. So that's what I have. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. That was excellent. One of the points I want to bring up is these speakers, these experts that we have on here that are talking about all of these issues, the crisis, the resiliency, the early warning, none of them have spoken before, and no one has talked with anyone else about their topics, but yet you're seeing a common theme in what is being discussed today. And actually Larry Regens, this morning, Dr. Regens kind of tapped into a lot of those. And I think it's very, very interesting how we are hearing from each one of these experts, and basically they're discussing these points. They're issues that we really need to think about. And all of these topics will be available. This is being recorded. And for those of you who have missed part of it or are just jumping in, you'll have the opportunity to listen to everyone. Thanks so much, Matt. I'm going to go ahead and I will go ahead and introduce the next speaker, who is going to be Seth Schachner, and he is the managing director of Strat Americas. Now, prior to that, he was a business development executive with Sony Music and with Microsoft, Liberty Media, Viacom, AOL, and Universal Music. He will be talking about film and video in the post-COVID world. Seth?
Great to see you. I am not able to start my video. Looks like you have to do it for me, if that's okay, Adriana. I have a, there we go. There we go. Got it. And I'm just going to share my desktop with everyone here.
Welcome.
Morning, everyone, or good afternoon. Good to be here, and great presentation so far. I'll just really quickly whip through my background. It's primarily focused in the area of media and digital media, primarily in partnerships, so content partnerships and alliances, and a lot of early stage business building on new platforms, some of which are probably overlap with some of the topics that you all have spoken to. I'd mentioned I was back in DC in the early days of AOL doing their very first music initiative, and spent a good chunk of my career with Sony Music, leading their digital music business in both North America before the digital music and digital entertainment business was real, and then after it as well. After iTunes had launched, they sent me to the Latin markets. I've worked pretty extensively in Latin America, building partnerships actually for Sony, and Strat Americas is all about similar functionality, but helping clients with new technology and exploiting new platforms. So I'm going to come at this from a very different angle, which is media and entertainment. There's certainly some overlap. I mean, I think what has happened in the last 4 or 5 months since this pandemic, it's been an enormous time of consumption for sure, with people cocooning at home and being locked into living rooms. And so for sure, folks are streaming more media. And what's been interesting about this is that, you're seeing tons of news, tons of video, some traditional, incumbents, which we'll talk about Spotify and some of the audio services, haven't had a bad time. It's actually been kind of even for them. They haven't had the best time either, though. But we're also seeing a lot of folks just buying, premium subscriptions, which is what folks like me in the media business started these business up for. So people are buying more and more subscriptions, whether they're using them or not, is kind of another case study. I've also seen quite a bit of variance outside the territories, outside the U.S., just in terms of how folks are consuming digital media. For sure, the morning commute has been lost for most. So if you're an audio service, a Pandora, an Apple Music, and Amazon that people might stream on a subway or a bus or on the ride in, that's obviously lost. And as is The Office, where sometimes people will do it. But you're seeing just tremendous discovery in terms of film and television programming. So and what we'll talk about is clearly some very interesting disruption in the landscape. So probably the biggest thing, I'm out in Los Angeles. I've been based out here for 2 years. What you're seeing is I think the seeds of a very large disruption in the traditional studio business. Actually, I mean, theaters, which we'll talk about, are obviously closed, or they were open for brief windows. And Hollywood, in all its different forms, from studios to Amazon and Apple, have very big picture, big budgeted kind of tent poles that they were initially planning on being in movie theaters, and that's really not the case. So in some cases, what the studios are doing is releasing them direct to the home. And you'll see this on if you have a Direct TV up there on the interface. And they kind of tend to fall out in different buckets. I mean, Trolls is probably the biggest one that rolled out over the past few months, and it hit spectacular numbers that were released. I think it was 100 million. And I think just because of the way the landscape is structured between the studio that released it, Universal, and the cable operators, the revenue they're able to recognize on that is probably greater. Some said they've double dipped, but there's hundreds of other mid-level pictures, Invisible Man, et cetera, that are getting released now through what we call OTT, or just direct to the homes. And then, what you're also seeing is what Apple's trying, which is just buying up big properties that were initially, targeted at going to theaters. The new one with Tom Hanks and just putting them out through their own apps, basically. But the really big ones, Fast and Furious 9, Mulan's a big one. The first one that is supposed to come out of the blocks in theaters is called Tenet. New James Bond. For the most part, I think the studios really need, theatrical releases for these properties. So they're kind of getting shifted to the next year out into 2021, and you're really not going to see them until they're ready. So they haven't opened the guns totally, but I'm just going to whip through, I think, some of the things that are particularly interesting here. I kind of call it looking under the hood, but there is just tons of transition that's going on. Some of it is related to the pandemic, but other things are just things that are naturally part of the ecosystem that are evolving out here. I mean, Apple is probably one of the most, I'd say, quiet and important ones out there, but they're really using their capital to try and build their own studio, actually. And they've been doing this prior to the pandemic for sure, but they have a model where they're just buying up pictures and rights and acquiring it all. And it's possible that some of them will never go through traditional releasing patterns like theaters and will just come out through TV Plus. But I think there's been quite a bit of concern or criticism leveraged at them just because of their outsized power. But I think to their credit, they're actually trying to build something. And whether or not it's successful in the first 2 years, I think it's a very ambitious effort they're taking. The producers that are here and certainly around the world, they've got a really shaken up landscape too. And so, Netflix is out there cutting checks, and we'll talk about them in a second, basically. But they're kind of the biggest gorillas in the room. They can just come in and write a giant check, buy a property up, and that's it. And that might be easier for some if you have a property, whether it's during the pandemic you need to sell or not, basically, just to pump it through their system. But also mention just, we talked about supply chain in different industries, from airlines to other industries. The supply chain here is completely, disrupted and delayed as well. So, not just the releasing, but the actual production and making of television and motion picture properties have been, initially stopped. And now there's plenty of regulations that are being, overlaid on the production processes now. So it's starting up again, but this is something that I think every one of the studios is struggling with, as are the release schedules, because they're really in flux now. There are things that continue to pop up that are, I guess I'd call them hot content. I mean, I've listed a couple examples here. I mean, Mad Men has been out for many years, but that's kind of been popping through new distribution vehicles. So you're actually going to see that, I think, as of today or yesterday on a new Amazon channel for free. And you can't stream it anymore on Netflix. It's left. So you gotta buy it on Amazon, that sort of thing. So there's still tons of these hot properties that are coming out that will be acquired by some of the individual interests. And then I didn't see Horatio this morning, but I'd also just mention there is blurring now between all the verticals that are out here. Spotify has expanded into podcasts and has video, and there are do hear the occasional rumors that Netflix would pick up an audio player. So there are tons of subscription services, and I'll get to it a little bit later, maybe too many. So I think it's possible that you'd see some consolidation over time. This is just a look at stock prices, but I mean, really in this market for what we call direct to home or OTT, which is kind of an industry term for over the top, meaning it's a direct to consumer service. Netflix by far and away is still the king in this market. Biggest number of subscribers, an enormous footprint internationally, everywhere it's launched, almost 200 territories, and a really, really big player in creating its own, original content. I've listed a few here, but what I think they're really doing interestingly is building content internationally in local territories, whether that's in the Middle East or Latin America or Europe. And, while they do get, a little bit of criticism for being too big and throwing their weight around, I think just if you think about these releasing channels like theaters that are closed now, and blocked. I think there's so many pictures that are out, whether they're US or independent or international, that there's a real home on Netflix. And I really think they've done quite a bit to kind of expand the appetite and the amount of repertoire and catalog of pictures and programming that's out there, and in a quite a positive way. There's obviously all of the studios, the networks have launched everything from NBC's Peacock to Viacom's got a free play, and certainly Disney Plus, which we'll talk about, all of which in their own way are trying to establish, individual strategies for the studios or networks for releasing, but are also for sure competing with Netflix. And I don't think Netflix is going away, or any of the new sort of studio products are Netflix killers. But there's a ton of competition out there, and Netflix is still kind of killing it. During this pandemic, and you can sit and binge. They still don't have advertising on it, so it's still a really big factor out in the market, particularly during the pandemic. These are just some examples of what's in the market now. Amazon, Hulu are some of the big incumbents that compete with Netflix. I mentioned all of these new offerings. Everyone from AT&T, Warner has one that has had mixed success. The new NBC Peacock, which is just launched, it's a little too early to talk about, but that's an ad-supported model that also has a subscription. And Disney Plus, I think, has had just made a really positive impression on me, and I think many others in the market. And I would just mention, as a great American company, they've really got enormous power because they can bundle properties like ESPN, or they control Hulu now. They've got the Fox catalog. And I mean, we're in the news in a big way just because of the releasing this, Hamilton out into the markets as well through Disney Plus. But this is an example of, I think, an enormously important streaming service that, probably could take on in a big way, Netflix and some of the other competitors out there. What's also happening, again, this is not purely due to COVID, but is running alongside of it, is just there's plenty of free alternatives. If any of you haven't tried it, I suggest checking out something called Pluto TV, which some friends and colleagues started quite independently a few years ago, and it is now part of the Viacom family. But it's an ad-supported model that aggregates tons of channels and has got a footprint everywhere throughout Latin America, throughout Europe, and I think Viacom and CBS are really using it in a big way to kind of compete as well. So there's also there have been things that have failed. I mean, Jeffrey Katzenberg, who was a big part of Disney and DreamWorks for many years, with Meg Whitman out here, launched something that I think in some ways was trying to create a new form of demand, a new product during this pandemic, actually. And I certainly don't think they planned to launch during the pandemic. But Quibi is a mobile first sort of short form video streaming services targeted at younger people, at millennials, who I guess before COVID, had 15 minutes in their day between Instagram and Starbucks to snack on video content, basically. And it hasn't worked, so it's clearly failing. It has tons of capital in it, and probably more publicity than anything in the town here. There may be a little bit of a longer burn because they're not. They have a capital in it, but that's an example of something that just kind of missed. And I think the pandemic did have a lot to do with it. So on the other downside, the piece of the entertainment business, I think everyone knows, that's kind of been obliterated for the moment, are theater chains. This is a very, very tough one, because I think just for loads of reasons, spacing of seats, everything related to just how things would open during the pandemic, this has been a much harder one, I think, to open up. And I think one thing that could come out of it is that when we get through this, that there's definitely still a role for blockbusters, and the studios are still, to some degree, very protective of theater chains, because they're a really critical part of the releasing patterns for their pictures, which flow into these other markets, whether they're digital or pay TV. So there's still, I think, quite a bit of appetite on the studio side to keep theaters open. But at the same time, I think they're starting to really peck away at it, because if this pandemic goes on for a long time, there are pictures they paid for, they budgeted, that need to be released. And, you're starting to see tons of them coming out through through the channels like DirecTV or their over-the-top services. So I think it'd be a very interesting thing to watch. I think certainly things like independent releases where there's smaller audiences are possible. And I think every type of COVID-19 distancing protocol, I think you have to think about for theater chains, basically. But this is probably, along with live music, where my background's in music, is probably the areas that have been really the most kind of decimated in the space. I mean, I would just mention, there's lots of other things that have also affected this business during the pandemic. I mean, the Oscars, the Golden Globes, plenty of the award shows are just being pushed out and delayed. That'll happen next year. I kind of mentioned some of the potential consolidation from other verticals. Certainly with some of the social unrest and social considerations that have happened, I think we're seeing that as well. I mean, even if you look on Netflix, the types of programming that is being promoted, I think, has reflected some of the big social changes in our country over the past year. And certainly with some of the institutions out here like the Oscars, you're seeing much more diverse representation in the new classes that are coming into it. So a lot of this is going on, at the same time. So if I had to kind of go through some of the big questions here, it's fair to ask, how disrupted is the business? Is this a permanent change? Or if we do come through a period where, the pandemic is resolved, or there's a vaccine, or people want to go back to some of their traditional behaviors, whether it's going to theaters or even to concerts, how and when will that happen? Or is this a really permanent change? I actually think, what you're seeing here is the seeds of a really new digital business. I mean, I think the studios and plenty of other entertainment companies have long wanted people to, consume their properties on different platforms for different pricing models. And certainly this wasn't in the plans, but I actually think you're seeing something, that could be, for real for a long time. And you'll see a nice blending of theaters over time is with some of these over-the-top services. So it's not just a blip to me. But the other thing, just sort of in the clutter, is that there's definitely too many subscription services in the market. So at some point, do you need Netflix, Amazon, Disney Plus, Hulu, whatever else it is, an AMC subscription, or will you ratchet back a little bit? And I think that's a very real question to ask. I think the studios have long talked about bundling products together, and Disney's offered it. Spotify's available in bundles. And I think to some degree that's still, not the most popular way to grab this content. So I think that's a real question going forward as well. And then, the idea of free content, ad-supported streaming services, if they keep growing exponentially, that's a very real question if you're trying to sell content against it. My experience in music is, free content is certainly, if it's free and widely available, and you don't really have a great paid alternative for it, it's very, very tough to kind of upsell. So I think that's a very real question. And then, there's just plenty of traditional pay TV operators around the world that are still delivering content into the homes, and they don't want to be pipes. And so you have to kind of ask your question, what happens there as well. So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you for the time. I'm happy if anyone wants to pop some questions in the chat or just via audio. Thank you.
Seth, that was an excellent presentation. I wish we had time. Everybody wants questions and answers, but unfortunately we can't during this forum. We will figure out another way to do that and allow our audience to actually have the ability to communicate. If anyone out there needs to reach one of these experts or is interested in following and getting more information, that will be available through our website, and we will provide you the contact information so that you can reach out directly as well. Thanks so much.
Thank you, folks.
I would next like to welcome Colonel Shad Satterthwaite. And he is going to be talking about a cohort. Our first 2020 cohort is coming this fall. And Shad's position is he is the director of our EMBA program in aerospace and defense at the Michael F. Price College of Business. Welcome, Shad.
Thank you, Adriana, and thank you for putting this together. I've really enjoyed this forum here today. It's been very interesting. We appreciate all of you joining us too. I don't have a presentation per se, other than just to tell a little bit about our program. We're launching a new executive MBA in aerospace and defense. And this is something that Wayne Thomas had been involved in when I came on board earlier this year. And we're excited to launch our new cohort in August. It's going to dovetail with our next seminar here. In fact, we hope to have some of you that have participated here perhaps participate with our cohort. It's basically a program where we take a group of people that are in the aerospace and defense industry, whether in military or in corporations, in that specific field, bring them together as a cohort for an in-residence course here in Oklahoma City. Then it's an online course, and then we will go to Europe for another in-residence phase there. We hope, Lucia, we can talk you into helping us out a little bit there. We'd love to go to Brussels and tour the European Commission and work with you all there too. I think this would be a wonderful opportunity for our students. More online courses, and we come back to Oklahoma City in a year. So we hope to integrate with a lot of what we're doing here with what's going on. So thank you again for participating. And Adriana, I'll give Mike back to you.
Thank you, Shad. As he mentioned, we do have some of our speakers that are going to be part of the kickoff. The kickoff starts on August 16th and it goes to August 19th, the 20th, and the 22nd is when we have the OU Global Risk and Threats Series Session 3. So you will be given more information, more details as we approach that time. The speakers that are going to be kicking that off include our special guest, Esti Peshin, will be kicking off the cohort's welcoming in August. And then we will have Tom Finan, who will be speaking later today. We will have Carol Chen, which will be speaking to us in August, and Matt Addington, that you've actually heard him tonight, or this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are located. All right, so now we are going to quickly give you some takeaways. There are only 3 to 5 minute takeaways from our experts that we had in June. Just to give you a little background maybe on those topics and what has happened, I want to quickly go through these. And our very first expert is Scott McDonald. He is a chief economist at Smith's Research and Grading. He is a former OCC International Economic Advisor, and he spoke to us about the food supply and concerns with food. Scott? Well, let's jump ahead and we can come back to Scott. Let's jump to Lou. Lou is with Ernst & Young. Lou, you may be ready. And, you know, it's been a long day, and I'm sure that everybody right now is winding up, but I would like to hear these takeaways. I think the audience is interested in knowing a little bit more of maybe what some of the challenges or some of the considerations of what has happened since the last time you were on, and maybe you have some takeaway as to what you heard today. Lou is with Ernst & Young. He is a forensic expert. He is a former FBI in counterintelligence and counterespionage and a federal officer, leader, right?
Yeah, I mean, a previous life in the FBI, NCIS, and the U.S. Marshals. But more importantly, today, you know, when I spoke in June, we spoke about security from everyone working at home, and I think in June we were very hopeful that it would be a quicker burn. We would have our shutdown for a couple of months, and then we ultimately would get going into back to normal. I was on a panel this week actually with Brian Hinman about IP theft, and I think my takeaway today would be, I think that we are in for the long haul now. I think we realized that our hope of a quick virus, mitigation is not going to happen. My firm, I think we're planning on being away from the office now until January at the earliest. So I think that it's a good time to almost double down on your home security to ensure that your networks are secure. The work that you're doing at home, you are protecting your intellectual property if you are in a firm like that, just to make sure that really the varied attack vectors that are enabled by working from home are really all encompassing. You think about your smart TV, even your toaster, really, your thermostat, your computers, your different Wi-Fi networks. And it's a really good time to make sure you patch and update, just to make it a little bit harder if anybody is trying to troll and get into your network. So my takeaway today is really, I thought it was great with the IP discussion, but I do think that we really need to focus on continued vigilance for home security, because I think we really are going to be in for the long haul, at least in regards to whenever COVID is going to end. So anyway, Adriana, that's all I have. I was quick on my quick takeaway, and I hope the panels continue on. The group that you bring together is really second to none, and I really appreciate being part of it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your few minutes. We really do appreciate it. Thanks, Lou. All right, we are back, and Scott, I believe, is now ready, and so we are going to continue with Scott. As I mentioned, Scott is a global chief economist. He is a chief economist with the Smith's Research and Grading, and he is a former OCC International Economic Advisor. Scott, if you'd like to go ahead and give us your takeaway or your bottom line.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
We can hear you, your video. Let me see if I can help. I'm not sure how to get your video back on.
The host is all right. Let me just check and see real quick. There we go.
There you go. You're on.
There we are. I do exist. First of all, I just want to say thanks very much, Adriana and Oklahoma University. It's been a great program, very topical, and you guys have done a great job. Listen, I'm going to be very short. Obviously, we want to move ahead. I'd say just make a couple of quick points. Dr. Regents began discussing the issue that we're undergoing a major stress test along the lines of the Columbian Exchange and the 14th century bubonic plague. Hopefully it's not as lethal as those two events were, but I think in terms of changing the landscape in which we live in, I think he's right on the target there. In terms of food security, in June, we were going through the process where COVID had penetrated the food supply chains. Issues rose at meatpacking places. Certainly borders were a place where food would get stuck. Certainly in developing countries where trucks weren't able to go across borders. And things were definitely disrupted and very questionable as to where they're going to head. Since that period, we've kind of settled into the mode where we're adapting. And I think the transformation process, the stress test, this is going to be a multi-year development, which we're going to have to deal with. But we are dealing with it. If you've been watching the meat industry, we're now looking at mechanical deboning. There's also a redesign of workstations. And one of the more important things that came about was no countries out there entirely halted the export of food. So we've maintained food supply across the world. We're using technology to deal with a lot of the issues, but this is going to be a long process. And there's a number of factors that have to be put on the table. But one of the issues, and I think it was the gentleman from the European Union mentioned that we're all in this together and we need to cooperate. So I'd say going forward, one of the big issues that sits here is the need for political will to harness all the capacity that we've put on the table. So it's a great conference. I've tried to keep my comments short, but that's where I'll leave it right now. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We will now turn to Shimin Bolin, and Shimin is a former VP with IBM. She is a board member and she is a global risk and recovery expert. Shimin, if you could give us your takeaway.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Throughout this conference, and thank you so much, Adriana, for putting together, we all are going to assume a risk if we don't adapt and transform. And I want to talk about one of the risks that we as corporations need to focus about. And I'm going to focus on e-commerce, because we don't focus on e-commerce to survive and grow, and then we will not be around for the next couple of years. We've already seen that COVID has drastically changed our view of retailing with its impact on e-commerce. I mean, it was the single largest event that drove a lot of us to embrace digital transformation as we moved our workforce to home. You know, we already have like 306 million people who were affected by the stay at home. And by mid-April, we saw 130% uptick as people who were using e-commerce. It was as if we were having Cyber Monday every day as we looked at the amount of transactions on the internet. 33% of our shopping centers will probably be gone by 2021, according to Forbes. And so even now, as the country opens up, there's 100% year-to-year growth. So to survive, in my opinion, companies must have an omni-channel strategy. We have to embrace online shopping, e-commerce, mobile applications, because, you know, the cat's already out of the bag. People have already seen and realized the benefits of online shopping. They've embraced it. And now our responsibility is to have a frictionless experience, all the way from order entry to supply chain, yet protect our personal data. Our success is going to be depend on our ability to have an effortless shopping experience, be it on the mobile or the tablet or the desktop. 24/7 inventory, secure access, personalized customer support. We better embrace these newer technologies that some of the other speakers talked about, which is artificial intelligence and machine learning. We better monetize the data so we have customer insight, because it's this intelligence that's going to give us the personal journey that our consumers want, as well as safeguard our supply chain. So I'd say embrace technologies, build those strong consumer relationships to strengthen your brand, build out e-commerce as part of your strategy toward a quick recovery. Behaviors already changed. COVID altered many of the shopping habits. And so online shopping and e-commerce will be key to your success. So especially in this post-COVID normal, realize you assume your own risk if you don't embrace all these changes. Thank you very much. I appreciate you having me on this platform.
Thanks, Sheeman. That was excellent. And her points, you know, are basically businesses, you have to do something. Stop waiting, because we're not going to go backwards. We're going forward. And this is part of going forward. Don't wait. So, you know, move forward now, and or else later on you're gonna wish you did. Thanks so much. Okay, next takeaway. Thank you. Next takeaway is coming from Ross Delson, and he is an anti-money laundering pundit. He is a former FDIC regulator, and he talked to us last time about trade-based money laundering. We have brought him back, and we'd like to know basically what is his take either on what has happened you know, since the last time he spoke, or basically any takeaways from today. Ross, if you could share with us.
Yes, great, Adriana. All I need to do is have you release the video. Great.
Back on.
Okay.
There you go.
Well, thanks, Adriana, for including me. Good news and bad news from listening to this conference. If an advanced civilization from another planet had decided to test the human race by giving us a global risk, a global threat, to see how we responded, so far we failed. And in a pretty miserable way. And I say we failed not just in our response to the coronavirus, but in our response to the origins of viruses like this, which is from eating wild animals. The most accepted theory of HIV/AIDS, the origins, is from eating wild animals, chimpanzees, hunting and eating of chimpanzees. We've had other examples of animals like chickens spreading disease. So why is that relevant to financial crime, which is my area? Because financial crime is an international in scope and depends on cooperation of nations in order to combat it. There's even a word for it, co-opetition, which is competitive cooperation. So we are lacking in competitive cooperation when it comes to the origins of the coronavirus, lacking in it when it comes to combating the coronavirus, but needing it now for a vaccine and for other measures once people get sick. And the same would be true of financial crime. Continue to need cooperation, must have cooperation when it comes to fighting financial crime because it's always international in nature. The US bears a special responsibility because the dollar is a reserve currency. And as such, everybody wants dollars. They want to invest their money here, and they want to sell drugs here and buy guns here. And therefore, the US is a center of financial crime and other types of crime as well. Also a center of the investment of proceeds of corruption, but nothing new there. So the good news is on the financial crime side, we've made efforts to work together globally for years. We'll continue to do that if we want to be successful. And the same lessons should apply to the coronavirus. So that's my sermon of the day. Thanks for including me. Hope this is helpful.
It is. Thank you, Ross, for your takeaway. And each one of these speakers has so much that we could, so many questions to ask, but we will put that together in another forum. We are going to turn now to Bruce Zagaris. Now, Bruce is not available today because he has no electricity in his office. And, this is part of life. We are dealing with a pandemic and we are dealing with everything related to that pandemic. So he pre-recorded last night and he was tired, but this was important to him and it's important that he share his message. And so we have captured it in a video and I will be sharing that with you now. He is a partner with Berliner, Cochrane and Rowe, and he is also the editor for the last, I want to say 40 plus, many, many years of the International Enforcement Law Reporter. It is read all over the world by the legal profession, and it gives you insights onto international law, complex issues where, laws are competing and not meshing, and reform and policy. This is a great source. So he has represented 14 governments on changes with regards to their money laundering laws and with regards to corruption. And we've asked him for his bottom takeaways. I'd like to go ahead and welcome Bruce Zagaris. Bruce is the editor of the International Enforcement Law Reporter. He is an attorney with Berliner, Cochrane and Rowe, and he has represented over 14 governments on issues involving money laundering and corruption.
You increasingly see criminals using the dark web, everything from arms trafficking, wildlife, illegal wildlife trade, child pornography, drug trafficking, you name it. They are, because they see that this enables them to be anonymous. A recent takedown by Eurojust and Europol of organized crime in Europe shows that the criminals have also been networking. So namely, the criminals were using something called EncroChat. EncroChat is a mechanism to enable criminals to talk on a dark web. And for $1,000, you can buy a crypto telephone, which you can also throw away. And so this was basically a anonymous network whereby criminals could sell things to each other and help each other out in drug trafficking and human trafficking. Well, yeah, one of the concerns is the tension between privacy and the need to quickly exchange information in order to take down
criminals.
Criminals, especially transnational organized crime, because they can quickly get into even central banks to, steal huge amounts of money. And the criminals are not only individuals, they're groups, and they're even states, which, in order to survive, uses cyber crimes to, be able to steal money and be able to conduct illicit trade. And so
I would think that they use it to their advantage, the fact that there are laws that conflict or don't mesh. And not only do they go where the laws are lax, but they will also go into jurisdictions where they know that it will be easier for others to get tangled because of standards and because there's competing regulations and whatnot. And in the same way that we need to be concerned with that, I'm sure that they're mapping out those territories as well. And that's a concern.
Yes, it only takes them, they only have to find 2 or 3 countries maybe to be able to conduct some of the illicit transactions, and it may take years to close down some of those networks.
Well, I appreciate you taking this time and giving us more insights. Thank you so much, Bruce. Take care.
Adriana. All the best. Cheers.
Bye-bye. Okay, so that was fun. We've got now Tom Finan is going to be giving us his takeaway, and Tom is the cyber growth strategist with the Willis Tower Watson, and he is also the former assistant general counsel for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI. He has held other positions as well. And Tom, could you please tell us about those positions?
You bet. I was a senior cybersecurity strategist and counsel with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, where I did a lot of work on critical infrastructure, cyber insurance, and creating incentives for investing in better cybersecurity. And prior to that, I worked at the U.S. House of Representatives with the Homeland Security Committee as the director and counsel of the Subcommittee on Intelligence, Information Sharing, and Terrorism Risk Assessment.
Wonderful. Now, that's why I always ask you to give us your background. We have pre-recorded Tom's takeaway as well. We did that yesterday, so we are going to share that with you, and hopefully you enjoy this video as well. Okay, so I would like to go ahead and welcome Tom Finan.
We really do find ourselves in the middle of a remote work revolution that COVID-19 has foisted on all of us. I think most of us are working from home full time, which is new. Prior to the pandemic, about 5 million Americans were doing so. They're estimating by the end of 2021, hopefully after we're all vaccinated, that there will be about 42 million people that will still be working from home as a new work model. That's a 733% increase. And what we're seeing, I think, is a growing awakening. HR leaders are starting to realize that they have a role to play. And that really jibes with some of the research we've been doing at Willis Towers Watson, where we have found over the course of many surveys of different companies around the world, there are these elements of an employee experience that if they're missing, sort of correlate to the likelihood that you're going to have a breach. So, if you're not focused on customers, like laser-like focus, if you don't work in a workplace that is flexible and adaptable to change, and boy, we need that during the period of the pandemic. But if you're also not showing respect for employee voice and giving them an opportunity to have a say, or opportunities to train and get paid for good performance, unfortunately, those are environments that what we're seeing statistically are basically, from a cultural angle, more likely to have a cyber event.
Well, you mentioned something very interesting. So what you're looking at basically is human performance and optimization. And how do we really get the best employees?
There needs to be cybersecurity training. So like the basic cyber hygiene that many of us are currently getting, it needs to be better. And I think that there needs to be more effort placed on really tailoring it to the particular job function that is being targeted for the training. You may need a different kind of cyber hygiene education if you're the CEO versus the summer intern.
Okay, these are excellent points. We're looking at this, and we're looking at this from all different angles. And Tom mentioned something very, very important. Cybersecurity has links. And not only does it have links as far as we can talk about other global threats and how the cyber attacks, when you're trying to fight cyber attacks, you have to also realize you've got money laundering issues. And do the laws that you've set up for money laundering fit nicely with the laws that you've got right now for fighting and combating cyber attacks? Those are some issues, but there's another issue here. What Tom is mentioning is a human element, the actual way that you're treating your employees. According to the research that they're doing, they're saying if you don't treat your employees correctly, if you don't provide that skilled training, the employee, at the end of the day, your company, if you're not investing there, you may have to invest later on in cyber attacks and cyber protecting your company. That's a big concern. So think about that and think about what steps you're taking to make your company safer and what steps you're making to keep your employees happy. Especially now at the time of COVID, we know that people are looking for jobs and people are looking for opportunities. We've got reform. We've got a lot of things going on. I will go ahead and end at this point. We have really enjoyed listening to all of these speakers, all of these visionaries, all of these leaders. And our next event will be August 22nd. In the meantime, if you want to learn more about who's coming or more about those who have spoken, or maybe you want to just re-listen to some of these presentations, they will be available on our OU GRTS website at the Price College of Business. Remember, ethics. At this time, we're looking for foundation. We're looking for trust, foundations of trust and integrity. That's what's most important. It's no longer a shareholder mentality. It is a stakeholder mentality. And you've heard before, be ethical when no one's watching. There's a new challenge. Be ethical when everyone is watching. Because when laws conflict and there are issues of non-compliance, sometimes you have to step out and you have to say something. So being ethical when everyone is watching, and maybe it's not the best position for you, but it is the right thing to do. That's the challenge for today. We're living in a different world and laws conflict, laws compete. We heard from Horacio what it takes, and the challenge is stay safe and, worry about your neighbor. That concludes our presentation for today, and this has been available through Manufacturing Talk Radio. We want to thank them again for live streaming, and have a good evening, good morning, or good afternoon. Take care. Bye-bye.